The committee will please come to order. Before we begin our hearing, the Chair wants to make some personal statements and statements on behalf of all of our colleagues about the seat that is next to me that is vacant. That seat was occupied by Representative Tom Lantos, who passed away this week. Those of us who have worked with Tom Lantos over the years know about his deep commitment and compassion, his integrity, and his leadership, not only on behalf of his constituents, but the people of this country and around the world. He was a champion for human rights. He was a member of this committee, but he was also chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And I think it's appropriate that, as a longtime member of this committee and a very esteemed member of Congress, that we recognize him and have a moment of silence. But before I call for that moment of silence, I'd like to recognize Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Having survived unalterable inhumanity, Tom Lantos spent the rest of his life giving voice to the ideals of human rights and freedom. His keen intellect, indomitable spirit, and wry insights left an indelible mark on all that he touched. We are grateful to have known him. He will be missed, but not forgotten. And we take solace in the Hebrew lesson: there are stars whose light only reaches the earth long after they have fallen apart. There are people whose remembrance gives light in this world long after they have passed away. Their light shines in our darkest nights on the road we must follow. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. And if you would all just please remember him in a moment of silence. This is our second hearing on Senator Mitchell's report on the illegal use of steroids and other performance-enhancing substances by players in Major League Baseball. This hearing is focused on the accuracy of an important section of that report, the section that is based on the information that strength and fitness coach Brian McNamee provided to Senator Mitchell. This committee has a special connection to the Mitchell report. In 2005, when Representative Tom Davis was our chairman, the two of us urged Commissioner Seelig to investigate baseball's history with performance-enhancing substances. The commissioner agreed with our suggestion and appointed Senator George Mitchell to lead that effort. Senator Mitchell's report is impressive and credible. He concluded that the use of performance-enhancing substance was pervasive for more than a decade, and that everyone in baseball, the players, the union, the owners, and the commissioner, were responsible for this scandal. Senator Mitchell released his report on December 13th. That same day, this committee announced a hearing with Senator Mitchell, Commissioner Seelig, baseball player union leader Don Fear. We intended for that hearing to close the chapter on looking at baseball's past. On the same day the Mitchell report was released, however, Roger Clemens, through his attorney Rusty Hardin, publicly challenged the accuracy of the section of the report that presented evidence of his use of steroids and human growth hormone. Mr. Hardin later told the committee that the Mitchell report is a horrible, disgraceful report. Given the committee's past work and our interest in an accurate record of baseball's steroid era, we have investigated the evidence in Senator Mitchell's report that relates to Mr. McNamee and the players he identified. Tom Davis and I made this decision reluctantly. We have no interest in making baseball a central part of our committee's agenda. But if the Mitchell report is to be the last word on baseball's past, we believed we had a responsibility to investigate a serious claim of inaccuracy. The committee's inquiry and this hearing are focused on the accuracy of the Mitchell report as it relates to information provided by Brian McNamee. Mr. Davis and I both believe that this narrow focus is important. We have carefully limited our inquiry to the relevant facts regarding Mr. McNamee's interactions with 3 players he claims to have supplied with these substances. In the course of this investigation, we've been able to probe more deeply than Senator Mitchell could. Senator Mitchell could only ask for information and had no power to subpoena documents or to insist that individuals talk to him. As the Chief Investigative Committee in the House of Representatives, we have greater authority and have been able to consider evidence that was not available to Senator Mitchell. I will now summarize some of the information our investigation has uncovered. Based on the information that Brian McNamee provided Senator Mitchell, he reported that Chuck Knobloch used human growth hormone in 2001. According to the report, quote, beginning during spring training and continuing through the early portion of the season, McNamee injected Knobloch at least 7 to 9 times with human growth hormone. Mr. Knobloch voluntarily met with the committee on February 1 and told us that Mr. McNamee was accurate when he told Senator Mitchell that Mr. McNamee had injected him with human growth hormone. Mr. Knobloch also told us about additional injections of human growth hormone that were not reported by Senator Mitchell. Mr. Knobloch told us that he administered HGH injections to himself in 2002. There is no mention of these injections in Senator Mitchell's report or in any published account. In a moving part of his deposition, Mr. Knobloch said, "My son was here today, and I'm trying not to get emotional about this, but I am trying to teach him a lesson that you need to do things in life that you are going to be willing to talk about openly and to tell the truth." On behalf of the committee, I want to thank Mr. Knobloch for his cooperation and for his candor in accepting responsibility for his actions. Based on the information Mr. McNamee provided, Senator Mitchell also reported that Andy Pettit used human growth hormone. Mr. McNamee has known Mr. Pettit since 1999 and has worked as his personal fitness coach. According to the Mitchell report, Mr. McNamee recalled that he injected Pettit with human growth hormone on 2 to 4 occasions in 2002. Andy Pettit voluntarily met with the committee for a sworn deposition on February 4 and told the committee that the information that Mr. McNamee provided to Senator Mitchell was accurate. In addition, Mr. Pettit told the committee about a second time he used human growth hormone. This occurred in 2004 when Mr. Pettit injected himself twice with HGH when he was recovering from an injury. Mr. Pettit had never told anyone outside of his family about this incident, but he volunteered it during the deposition because he wanted to provide a complete record to the committee. Mr. Pettit also provided additional information of particular relevance to this hearing, which I'll describe later in my statement. On behalf of the committee, I want to commend Mr. Pettit for his cooperation. He found himself in an extremely uncomfortable position, but he did the right thing and told the truth. During his deposition, he was asked how he approached this difficult situation, and he said, quote, "I have to tell you the truth, and one day I have to give an account to God and not to nobody else about what I've done in my life, and that's why I've said and shared the stuff that I wouldn't like to share with you all," end quote. Mr. Pettit's consistent honesty makes him a role model on and off the field. And finally, based on the information that Brian McNamee provided, Senator Mitchell reported that Roger Clemens used human growth hormone and steroids. Brian McNamee told Senator Mitchell that on over 20 occasions he injected Roger Clemens with either human growth hormone or steroids. All of us from time to time can have memory lapses. If any of us were asked to recall a specific incident or event that occurred 10 years ago, we might get the substance right, but we'd be off on some details. I think most of us can relate to that. It's rare, however, to have the situation the committee faces today. Mr. Clemens and Mr. McNamee have both cooperated fully with us, and both have given us sworn statements. They both insist that they are telling the truth, but their accounts couldn't be more different. They don't disagree on a phone call or one meeting. They disagree on whether over a period of 4 years, Mr. McNamee repeatedly injected Mr. Clemens with steroids and human growth hormone. It's impossible to believe that this is a simple misunderstanding. Someone isn't telling the truth. If Mr. McNamee is lying, then he has acted inexcusably, and he has made Mr. Clemens an innocent victim. If Mr. Clemens isn't telling the truth, then he has acted shamefully and has smeared Mr. McNamee. I don't think there's anything in between. After we had completed our depositions, my instinct was to cancel this hearing and issue a written report. We've learned a lot about Mr. McNamee's allegations and Mr. Clemens' account, and I thought a bipartisan report setting out the facts with Mr. Davis might be the most effective way to present the results of our investigation. But others had different views, and I was particularly influenced by the view of Mr. Clemens' attorneys, who thought it would be unfair if the committee issued a report without giving Mr. Clemens the opportunity to testify in public. So I decided to proceed with this hearing, which I expect will be the last hearing this committee will have on baseball's past or the Mitchell report. In today's hearing, Mr. McNamee's credibility will be bolstered by the testimony the committee received from Mr. Knobloch and Mr. Pettit in their depositions. Mr. McNamee named 3 players in the Mitchell report: Mr. Knobloch, Mr. Pettit, and Mr. Clemens. None of these players talked with Senator Mitchell, but now 2 of them have told us under oath that Mr. McNamee told the truth as it related to them. Senator Mitchell told us in our January 15th hearing that 2 other factors supported Mr. McNamee's credibility. First, he said that the only penalty Mr. McNamee faced in dealing with federal prosecutors was perjury, which meant that he faced legal jeopardy only if he lied. And second, Mr. McNamee was being paid by Mr. Clemens in 2007, as he had been paid for many years, and he had an economic interest against implicating the individual who supported his livelihood and was his most prominent client. On the other hand, the committee learned that Mr. McNamee has twice failed to tell the government investigators the full truth. There was an incident in Florida in 2001 that is not related to the matter before us, but relates to Mr. McNamee's credibility. We are not going to make that incident part of today's hearing, but Mr. Davis and I have prepared a joint statement that will be part of today's record. We are stipulating for the record that Mr. McNamee lied to police officers when they investigated the matter. Mr. McNamee does not dispute that he lied, but told us he did it to protect others. Mr. McNamee was never charged in that case. Of more direct relevance to this matter, it's clear from our deposition with Mr. McNamee that he didn't tell federal prosecutors everything he knew. In his deposition, Mr. McNamee acknowledged that he misled prosecutors about the number of injections he gave Mr. Knobloch and Mr. Clemens. Until last month, he also withheld from the prosecutors physical evidence that he says implicates Mr. Clemens. Mr. McNamee says he did not tell the full truth because he, and I quote him, "I was trying not to hurt the guy. I felt awful for being in the situation I put myself into. There was a feeling of betrayal. I shouldn't have done it, but I didn't want to hurt him as bad as I could," end quote. That's no excuse. It's a serious matter that Mr. McNamee did not tell the investigators the full truth. We need to keep this in mind in evaluating his credibility today. Mr. Clemens has visited with many committee members personally in the last few days. One point he and his attorneys have made is that it would make no sense for him to testify under oath if he actually used steroids. In judging his credibility, the risk that he takes by testifying today needs to be taken into account. It's also relevant that Mr. Clemens is a credible and convincing person. I'm also aware of the tremendous amount of good that Mr. Clemens has done through the Roger Clemens Foundation, and I thank you for helping so many children. But it is also true that as we move forward in our investigation, we found conflicts and inconsistencies in Mr. Clemens' account. During his deposition, he made statements we know are untrue, and he made them with the same earnestness that many of the committee members observed in person when he visited your offices. In other areas, his statements are contradicted by other credible witnesses or simply implausible. At the beginning of his sworn deposition, Mr. Clemens repeatedly told the committee that he never talked with Brian McNamee about human growth hormone. We know from his later testimony that these statements were false. Mr. Clemens told the committee that Mr. McNamee injected him with a dangerous pain medication, lidocaine, in a public area of a team training room. Dr. Ron Taylor, the team doctor, Melvin Craig, the team trainer, both told the committee that this account does not make any sense. During his interview on 60 Minutes, Mr. Clemens asserted that Mr. McNamee didn't tell me a word about the Mitchell report, and he lambasted Mr. McNamee for sending him an email about fishing equipment a week before the release of the report. Well, these statements were not accurate. 8 days before the release of the Mitchell report, Mr. McNamee called Mr. Clemens' representatives and told them about the report. Mr. McNamee also allowed Mr. Clemens' investigators to interview him at length about the evidence in the Mitchell report before the release of the report. We know this happened because those investigators secretly taped the interview. There is also a direct conflict between Mr. Clemens' testimony and Mr. Pettit's. During his deposition, Mr. Pettit told the committee that in 1999 or 2000, Mr. Clemens, quote, told me he had taken HGH, end quote. During his deposition, Mr. Pettit was asked whether he had any doubt about that recollection, and he said, quote, I mean, no, he told me that, end quote. Mr. Clemens said this conversation never took place. Mr. Pettit also said he had a second conversation with Mr. Clemens about HGH in 2005. This conversation took place after the committee's hearings on steroids in baseball, when Mr. Pettit asked Mr. Clemens what would he say about the HGH use if asked. According to Mr. Pettit, Mr. Clemens said, I never told you that. I told you that Debbie used HGH, end quote. Debbie Clemens is Mr. Clemens' wife. Well, we learned through our depositions of Mr. Clemens and Mr. McNamee that Mr. Clemens did inject Mr. McNamee did inject Mr. Clemens' wife with HGH. Mr. Clemens and Mr. McNamee give completely different accounts of this injection. Mr. Clemens says that Mr. McNamee injected Mrs. Clemens without his knowledge. Mr. McNamee says that Mr. Clemens asked him to inject Mrs. Clemens. What they do agree upon, however, is that these injections occurred in 2003. That makes it impossible that Mr. Clemens, when he spoke to Mr. Pettit in 1999 or 2000, could have been referring to these injections of Mrs. Clemens. Mr. Pettit also told the committee that he talked about both of these conversations with his wife. Because of the relevance of this evidence to the committee's investigation, the committee asked Mr. Pettit and his wife to submit affidavits to the committee. And this is an excerpt of what Mr. Pettit wrote, and I'm quoting. In 1999 or 2000, I had a conversation with Roger Clemens in which Roger told me he had taken human growth hormone. This conversation occurred at his gym in Memorial, Texas. He did not tell me where he got the HGH or from whom, but he did tell me that it helped the body recover. I told my wife Laura about the conversation with Roger soon after it happened. In 2005, around the time of the congressional hearing into the use of performance-enhancing drugs in baseball, I had a conversation with Roger Clemens in Kissimmee, Florida. I asked him what he would say if asked by reporters if he ever used performance-enhancing drugs. When he asked what I meant, I reminded him that he had told me that he had used HGH. Roger responded by telling me that I must have misunderstood him. He claimed that it was his wife, Debbie, who used HGH. I said, okay, or words to that effect, not because I agreed, but because I wasn't going to argue with him. Shortly after that, I told my wife, Laura, about the second conversation with Roger about HGH and his comment about his wife. That's what Mr. Pettit told us in his affidavit. And this is what his wife, Mrs. Pettit, wrote. Quote, in 1999 or 2000, Andy told me he had a conversation with Roger Clemens in which Roger admitted to him using human growth hormone. A few years later, I believed in 2005, Andy again told me of a conversation with Roger Clemens about HGH. Andy told me that he had been thinking that if a reporter asked him, he would tell the reporter of his own use of HGH in 2002. He said that he told Roger Clemens this and asked Roger what he would say if asked. Andy told me that in this 2005 conversation, Roger denied using HGH and told Andy that Andy was mistaken about their earliest conversation. According to Andy, Roger said that it was his wife, Debbie, who used HGH, end quote. Well, we'll sort through all of this today. I suspect we'll find inconsistencies in both Mr. Clemens and Mr. McNamee's accounts, and each member will have to reach his or her own conclusions. These conclusions should not be based on whether we like or dislike Mr. McNamee or like or dislike Mr. Clemens. Our conclusions must be on the facts. During the course of our investigation, we've acquired a considerable amount of relevant evidence. We've taken the depositions of Mr. Clemens, Mr. Pettit, Mr. McNamee. We've conducted transcribed interviews of Mr. Knobloch, several team trainers and doctors, and Jim Murray, a representative of Mr. Clemens. We've received emails, communications, and transcripts of tape recordings. We've also received affidavits and declarations from several witnesses. Ranking Member Davis and I have agreed to make this evidence part of the hearing record with appropriate redactions to protect personal privacy. I know, given the nature of this hearing, that our witnesses have strong feelings, and I suspect that some committee members may share these. I want to caution both the witnesses and the members. The Chair will not tolerate any outbursts or defamatory comments at this hearing. This is an unusual hearing, but we've tried to be as fair as we can throughout this investigation, and I'm determined that this hearing will also be conducted in the fairest way possible for everyone. I'd like to now recognize Tom Davis for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've just heard the bells ring. Let me ask, we may be interrupted frequently today with votes. I think there's some chaos on the floor, which isn't uncommon. I'm willing to sit through the hearing, if you are,
yes.
and pair each other on motions to adjourn and dilatory motions, if that'd be okay with the chairman.
Well,
other members can make theirs.
The two of us will pass up those votes that are procedural. Members will use their own judgment and guidance as to whether they will join us in missing those votes. But the hearing will continue.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing today, and thank you for reminding us all why we're here today. It gives me no joy to have joined you in calling this hearing. We were faced with an unenviable choice: allow a strenuous challenge to the Mitchell report to stand without review, or open ourselves up to criticism that we're grandstanding, that we're acting like self-appointed prosecutors trying the claims of that report. In the end, we decided we had a duty to probe the challenge, that we needed to help determine whether the Mitchell report, with its 409-page sordid picture of backroom drug deals and players injecting each other with illegal substances right in their locker rooms, Whether that report could and should still stand as proof positive that baseball's efforts to combat illegal drug use needs a fresh look. Our hearing yesterday was a helpful reminder of the importance of our work. We learned how those attempting to sell HGH are scamming consumers and breaking the law. We learned of the terrible risks associated with unapproved use. We learned yet again of the dangers and phony messages being sent to young athletes that there are magic pills and wonder drugs that can grease their path to the Hall of Fame. So while today's hearing may be awkward and joyless, we know why we're here. We're here to again try to disrupt and discredit the crass messages aimed at our children. We can't be arbitrators of credibility, at least not this soon after gathering evidence. We can't be lured into attaching a coefficient of credibility to different witnesses. We can only collect facts and present them as completely and dispassionately as possible. Today, we'll let the American people judge who's to be believed in this unfortunate battle of wills, memories, and reputations. Coming into today's hearing, we have before us two very different stories. They're in many ways incompatible. Someone's lying in spectacular fashion about the ultimate question. But we have not prejudged, nor should anyone tuning in today prejudge. Let's listen to the witnesses. Let's probe disparities and contradictions. Let's remain fair and objective. And then let's decide whether anything we've learned leaves the Mitchell Report in a less glowing light than it's thus far enjoyed. As we did in January, we want to commend Senator Mitchell for his work. He was saddled with a daunting task and list of obstacles: no subpoena power, little cooperation from players, and only tepid enthusiasm among owners more concerned with filling seats than protecting public health. He produced a sober, even-handed document whose factual assertions, with little exception, have remained unchallenged. Today, we offer a stage to the primary, most vocal challenger. What better way to further examination of the strength of the Mitchell Report than to offer someone of Roger Clemens' stature the chance to tell his story and have that story in turn examined as well. Mr. Clemens, because of the scrutiny he's received, because of his accomplishments and profile, because of the good work his foundation has done for many years, deserves this opportunity. And so does his former friend, trainer, and now accuser, Brian McNamee. At our first hearing on January 15th, we learned from Senator Mitchell that players were required to consent to an interview before seeing the evidence against them. And they couldn't simply appear, review the evidence, and leave if they concluded they had nothing further to say. It's not hard to imagine why players like Roger Clemens might have opted to remain mum under this scenario. Today is his chance to speak free of these constraints, yet under oath and before a multitude of interested observers. We'll ask our witnesses about the contradictions, open threads, and mysteries we've uncovered through interviews, depositions, and document review. We'll find out if witnesses are sticking to their stories. We'll probably discover that some lines of inquiry are red herrings. We'll undoubtedly learn things that are new to us, and perhaps we'll end up as confused and as uncertain as ever. But reaching consensus on whether the Mitchell Report is now sullied does not require us to reach firm conclusions or judgments on the veracity of our witnesses today. Factual resolution, whether through exoneration or heightened skepticism, need not be our goal. Today's testimony and questioning may not be tidy. Our hearing may not end up wrapped in a neat package and may not fit the storyline anticipated by many and hoped for by some. That's okay. I think we'll have heard and learned enough to soon conclude whether we can return to the process of implementing the best of Senator Mitchell's recommendations. This is not a court of law. The guilt or innocence of the players accused in this report and of the accusers is not our concern. Our focus is and has been on Senator Mitchell's recommendations more than his findings. We're here to save lives, not ruin careers. Why? Because the health of young athletes across the country is at stake, and we won't hesitate to defend their interests, even if the process isn't always pretty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davis. By agreement, we will proceed without objection in questioning in the following way after the witnesses presented their testimony. One 15-minute round for both the majority and the minority, controlled by the chairman and the ranking member. Two 10-minute rounds for both the majority and the minority, controlled by the chairman and the ranking member. Gentlemen, we welcome you to our hearing today. We appreciate your being here. It's the practice of this committee that all witnesses that testify before us testify under oath. The chair would like to ask the three of you to please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. The chair will note for the record that each of the witnesses answered in the affirmative. There are only two of you who will be making opening statements. Mr. Sheeler is here to answer questions. We will give each of the witnesses adequate time to make their presentation, and we'd like to start with you, Mr. Clemens. There's a button on the base of the mic. Be sure it's on, and be sure it's close enough to you so that we can hear everything you have to say.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to express my sympathy to the committee on the passing of Chairman Lantos, a man I understand with remarkable personal history and a man who served this country with great distinction. My condolences go out to his family and all of you. Thank you for allowing me to tell you a little bit about myself and how I've conducted my professional career over the past 25 years. I've always believed that hard work and determination were the only ways to be successful and to reach goals. Shortcuts were not an option. This was instilled in me since I was a young boy by my mother and my grandmother. Over the course of my career, I've had the opportunity to work with many trainers, chiropractors, physical therapists, and other professionals to try and educate myself and to use what knowledge they had to keep my body in the best shape it could possibly be. I met Brian McNamee while playing for the Toronto Blue Jays in 1998. I trusted him, put faith in him, brought him around my family and my children. I treated him just like I've done everyone else I've met in my life, like family. I'm a positive person, and I enjoy doing things for others. I'm not just a ball player. I'm a human being. Baseball is what I do. It's not who I am. I played the game because of my love and respect for it. I've devoted my life to it and pride myself an example for kids, my own as well as others. I've always tried to help anyone who crossed my path that was in need. To that end, here we are now with me being accused of steroids and cheating the game of baseball. If I'm guilty of anything, it is of being too trusting of everyone, wanting to see the best in everyone, being too nice to everyone. If I'm considered to be ignorant of that, then so be it. I've chosen to live my life with a positive attitude. Yet I'm accused of being a criminal, and I'm not supposed to be angry about that. If I keep my emotions in check, then I'm accused of not caring. When I did speak out, I was accused of protesting too much, so I'm guilty. When I kept quiet at the advice of my attorney until he could find out why in the world I was being accused of these things, I must have had something to hide, so I'm guilty. People who make false accusations should not be allowed to define another person's life. I have freely, without question, shared my talents God gave me with children, young and old, and I will continue to do so. I've been blessed with a will and a heart that carries me on in life. I've had thousands of calls, emails from friends, working partners, teammates, fans, and men that have held the highest office in our country telling me to stand strong. These words are welcome during some very tough times for my family and me. Do I think steroids are good for helping someone's performance? No. In fact, I think they are detrimental. These types of drugs should play no role in the game of baseball and athletics at any level. Should there be more extensive testing? Yes. I think whatever is necessary for everyone involved to satisfy themselves that is not going on should be done. I've been accused of something I'm not guilty of. How do you prove a negative? No matter what we discuss here today, I'm never going to have my name restored. But I've got to try and set the record straight. However, by doing so, I'm putting myself out there to all of you, knowing that because I said that I didn't take steroids, that this is looked as an attack on Senator Mitchell's report. Where am I to go with that? I'm not saying Senator Mitchell's report is entirely wrong. I am saying Brian McNamee's statements about me are wrong. Let me be clear. I have never taken steroids or HGH. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clemens. Mr. McNamee, be sure the button is pushed on the mic and that it's close enough to you so that we hear every word.
Thank you, Chairman Waxman, ranking members Davis, and other members of the committee. My name is Brian Gerard McNamee, and I was once the personal trainer for one of the greatest pitchers in the history of baseball, Roger William Clemens. During the time that I worked with Roger Clemens, I injected him on numerous occasions with steroids and human growth hormone. I also injected Andy Pettit and Chuck Knobloch with HGH. The Mitchell Report documented the pervasiveness of steroids and HGH in Major League Baseball, and I was unfortunately part of that problem. I want to be clear that what I did was wrong. I want to apologize to the committee and to the American people for my conduct. I have helped taint our national pastime. I hope that my testimony here today allows me, in some small way, to be part of the solution. I'm not proud of what I've done, and I am not proud to testify against the man I once admired. To those who have suggested that I take some personal satisfaction in bringing down Roger Clemens, let me assure you, nothing could be further from the truth. I take responsibility for my actions in the hopes that others may learn from my mistakes. My father, who served for 24 years with the New York City Police Department, instilled in me that people are human and make mistakes, and that I should always step up and acknowledge my mistakes despite the consequences. And so here we are. Providing information to federal investigators has been very painful for me, and I did not seek out federal investigators. They sought me out. I did not want to cooperate because I knew that if I had told the truth, I would be providing damaging information against people who I worked for. And in the end, I cooperated with federal investigators and with Senator Mitchell. Make no mistake. When I told Senator Mitchell that I injected Andy Pettit with performance-enhancing drugs, I told the truth. Andy Pettit, who I know to be honest and decent, has since confirmed this. And make no mistake, when I told Senator Mitchell that I injected Chuck Knobloch with performance-enhancing drugs, I told the truth. Chuck Knobloch has also confirmed this as well. And make no mistake, when I told Senator Mitchell that I injected Roger Clemens with performance-enhancing drugs, I told the truth. I told the truth about steroids and human growth hormone. I injected those drugs into the body of Roger Clemens at his direction. Unfortunately, Roger has denied this and has led a full court attack on my credibility. And let me be clear, despite Roger Clemens' statements to the contrary, I never injected Roger Clemens or anyone else with lidocaine or B12. I have no reason to lie and every reason not to. If I do lie, I will be prosecuted. I was never promised any special treatment or consideration for fingering star players. I was never coerced to provide information against anyone. All that I was ever told to was to tell the truth to the best of my ability. And that is what I have done. I told the investigators that I injected 3 people, 2 of whom I know confirmed my account. The third is sitting at this table. When I first provided information to federal investigators, I had not spent much time going back over these facts and trying to piece together the details. And I guess maybe I wanted to downplay the extent of their use because I felt I was betraying the players I had trained. In the following weeks and months, I've had the opportunity to think about these events and consider the specific drug regimens we used. As a result, I now believe that the numbers of times I injected Roger Clemens and Chuck Knobloch was actually greater than I initially stated. Additionally, I recently provided physical evidence to federal investigators that I believe will confirm my account, including syringes that I used in 2001 to inject Roger Clemens with performance-enhancing drugs. This evidence is 100% authentic, and the DNA and chemical analysis should bear this out. To put in context, the issue of steroids and performance-enhancing drugs in baseball was starting to pick up steam in 2000. While I liked and admired Roger Clemens, I don't think that I ever really trusted him. Maybe my years as a New York City police officer had made me wary, but I just had the sense that if this ever blew up and things got messy, Roger would be looking out for number 1. I viewed the syringes as evidence that would prevent me from being the only fall guy. Despite my misgivings about Roger, I have always been loyal to a fault, a trait that has gotten me into trouble in the past. Even though I saved the material, I never considered using it. When I met with federal investigators, I still did not want to destroy Roger Clemens. I was hoping this issue would just fade away. It has not faded away. And everything changed for me on January 7th when Roger Clemens' lawyer played a secretly tape-recorded conversation between me and Roger in which my son's medical condition was discussed on national TV. It was despicable. The next day, I retrieved the evidence and contacted my lawyers and the federal investigators. The whole experience has been a nightmare for my family. I've had to revisit and read about in the press mistakes I have made in the past and serious mistakes concerning an incident that happened in Florida in 2001 when I was a member of the Yankee organization. I lied to police officers to protect friends, ball players, coaches, and myself with whom I worked. I was wrong, and I deeply regret my actions. Today, my livelihood is in ruins, and it is painful beyond words to know that my name will be forever linked to a scandal in the sport I love. Yet, the spotlight generated by Senator Mitchell's report and this hearing can help clean up the drug culture in baseball so that young people no longer see performance-enhancing drugs as a necessary shortcut to success. Maybe, just maybe, all the pain and shame will have served a greater good. Thank you, and I'll be happy to answer all your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. McNamee. Under the previous unanimous consent agreement, we will control 15 minutes in the first round, and Mr. Davis 15 minutes in the, on his side. And I'd like to yield at this time 5 minutes to Mr. Cummings. I'd like to yield full 15 minutes to Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for being with us this morning. And I was very pleased to hear both of the witnesses talk about children, because that's what this was all about when we started. So many children trying to emulate their sports stars. I'm going to ask you a few questions, Mr. Clemens, and I first want to make sure that you're very clear. You understand that you're under oath, is that correct?
That's correct, Mr.
And you know what that means, is that correct?
That's correct.
Very well. First of all, Mr. Pettit, Andy Pettit, is one of the most respected players in the Major League, and commentator after commentator has said that he is one of the most honest people in baseball. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that, yes, sir.
All right, keep your voice up.
I would agree with that, yes, sir.
In fact, this is what your own lawyer, Rusty Hardin, said about Mr. Pettit in the New York Times. And I quote, "We have nothing to fear about what Andy may testify to. Everyone says that Andy is honest. We have no reason to believe he will lie." Would you agree with that, on that statement your lawyer made?
I would agree with that, yes.
Very well. Now, Mr. Clemens, I want to ask you just one thing. In his deposition, Mr. Pettit told the committee that he had a conversation with you in 1999 or 2000 in which you admitted that you used human growth hormones. Is this true?
It is not.
So you did not tell Mr. Pettit that you used human growth hormones?
I did not.
But at the same time, you just said that he's a very honest fellow. Is that right?
I believe Andy to be a very honest fellow, yes.
Very well. Let's continue. In his deposition, Mr. Pettit was honest and forthcoming with the committee. He told us things that were embarrassing that we had no way of knowing except through his own testimony. First, he confirmed that Mr. McNamee injected him with HGH in 2002, which is in the Mitchell report. You understand that, right?
I do.
Then he told us that he injected himself again in 2004. We did not know about the 2004 injection, but he volunteered that information because he wanted the committee to know the entire truth. It was hard for Mr. Pettit to tell the committee about the 2004 injections. The circumstances which he described in length were exceptionally personal and embarrassing. But it was even harder for him to talk about you, Mr. Clemens. He's friends with both you and Mr. McNamee. and he felt caught in the middle. During his deposition, he was asked how he would resolve the conflict between two friends. Here is what he said, and I quote, "I have to tell you all the truth, and one day I have to give an account to God and not to nobody else of what I've done in my life. And that's why I've said and shared the stuff with y'all that I would not like to share with y'all," end of quote. Now, Mr. Clemens, I'm reminding you that you are under oath. Mr. Clemens, do you think Mr. Pettit was lying when he told the committee that you admitted using human growth hormones?
Mr. Congressman, Andy Pettit is my friend. He was my friend before this. He will be my friend after this. And again, I think Andy has misheard.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
I believe Andy has misheard, Mr. Congressman, on his comments about myself using HGH, which never happened. The conversation that I can recall that I had with Andy Pettit was at my house in Houston while we were working out, and I expressed to him about a TV show, something that I've heard about 3 older men that were using HGH and getting back their quality of life from that. Those are the conversations that I can remember. Andy and I's friendship and closeness was such that, first of all, when I learned when he said that he used HGH, I was shocked. I had no idea. When I just heard your statement and Andy's statement about that he also injected himself, I was shocked. I had no idea that Andy Pettit had used HGH. My problem with what Andy says and why I think he misremembers is that if Andy Pettit knew that I had used HGH, or I had told Andy Pettit that I had used HGH, before he would use the HGH, what have you, he would have come to me and asked me about it. That's how close our relationship was. And then when he did use it, I'm sure he would have told me that he used it. And I say that for the fact that we also used a product called Hydroxycut and Thermacor. It had ephedra in it, from what I understand to be a natural tree root. I believe ephedra was banned at some 2004, something of that nature. A player in Baltimore passed away because of it. Andy and I talked openly about this products, and so there's no question in my mind that we would have talked. If he knew that I had tried or done HGH, which I did not, he would have come to me to ask me those questions.
Well, let's continue. In the deposition, we wanted to make absolutely sure, because we knew the significance of this, that Mr. Pettit had a clear recollection. And let me read another excerpt from the deposition. And this was a question to Mr. Pettit. You recollect a conversation with Mr. Clemens? Your recollection is that he said he was taking human growth hormone? Answer, yes. And you have no doubt about that recollection? I mean, no, he told me that. Now, Mr. Clemens, you know Mr. Pettit well. You just, again, described your relationship. You described him as a close friend in your deposition. Would he tell the Congress that one of his close friends was taking an illegal performance-enhancing drug if there were any doubt in his mind about the truth of what he was saying?
Mr. Congressman, once again, I believe in my, I'm sorry?
Now, I just want you to just go ahead and answer that. Do you think he would do that?
I think he misremembers.
Very well.
Of our conversation. And let me add, in 2006, he and I had a conversation in Atlanta's locker room when this LA Times report became public about a Grimsley report, and they said that Andy's and my name were listed in that. And I remember him coming into that room, the coach's room, the the main office there of the clubhouse attendant and sitting down in front of me, wringing his hands and looking at me like he saw a ghost. And that, he looked right at me and said, "What are you going to tell him?" And I told him that I'm going out here and I'm going to tell him the truth. I did none of this. I never worked out with Jason Grimsley. He was a teammate of mine, and I never worked out with him. And I'm going to go out here and tell him the truth. That alone should have confirmed Andy's misunderstanding that I've ever told him that I used HGH.
Very well. Let's continue, because I want to make sure that I get through some very key points. Mr. Clemens, you have been very critical of Mr. McNamee's motives. You just did it a few minutes ago. What possible motive would Mr. Pettit have to fabricate a story about you, his friend?
Andy would have no reason to.
Very well. This point was so important, we went back to Mr. Pettit a third time. A third time. We asked him to submit an affidavit to the committee. This gave him a chance to express his recollection clearly without the pressures of a deposition. I want to read to you what he wrote. It says, in 1999 or 2000, I had a conversation with Roger Clemens in which Roger told me that he had taken human growth hormones. This conversation occurred at his gym in Memorial, Texas. He did not tell me where he got the HGH or from whom, but he did tell me that it helped the body recover. It is not just Mr. Pettit who recollects this conversation. During his deposition, Mr. Pettit told us that he tells his wife everything. So we asked his wife to give us an affidavit about what she knew. And understand, this is under oath. Let me read to you what his wife said in her affidavit. I, Laura Pettit, do depose and state in 1999 or 2000, Andy told me he had had a conversation with Roger Clemens in which Roger admitted to him using human growth hormones. Mr. Clemens, once again, I remind you, you're under oath. You have said your conversation with Mr. Pettit never happened. If that was true, why would Laura Pettit remember Andy telling her about the conversation?
Once again, Mr. Commerce, I think he misremembers the conversation that we had. Andy and I's relationship was close enough to know that if I would have known that he had done HGH, which I now know, that if he was knowingly knowing that I had taken HGH, we would have talked about the subject. He'd have come to me to ask me about the effects of it.
Well, the fact is, Mr. Clemens, that apparently now you know he knew it, and he didn't tell you. Has your mind changed about his credibility?
Andy's a fine gentleman. I have no reason, again.
Very well.
I think he misremembers.
Very well. Let me go on.
Again, our relationship was close enough that if he knew that I had tried HGH, which I hadn't, and he would have come to me and talked to me and discussed this subject.
I understand. In 1999 or 2000 conversations is not the only conversation that Mr. Pettit remembers having with you about HGH. He also remembers a second conversation very clearly. This conversation took place in 2005. Let me read to you what he wrote about this conversation in his affidavit. In 2000, and I quote, in 2005, around the time of the congressional hearings into the use of performance-enhancing drugs in baseball, I had a conversation with Roger Clemens in Kissimmee, Florida. I asked him what he would say if asked by reporters if he had ever used performance-enhancing drugs. When he asked what I meant, I reminded him that he had told me that he had used HGH. Roger responded by telling me that I must have misunderstood him. He claimed that it was his wife, Debbie, who used HGH. And I said, okay, or words to that effect, not because I agreed with him, but because I wasn't going to argue with him. This conversation happened just 3 years ago, and it is a kind of conversation that most people would remember. Sure. It is hard for me to imagine that Mr. Pettit made up this conversation. Did you have a conversation with him to this effect?
I don't believe I had a conversation in 2005 with him in Kissimmee, Florida. We'd have been with the Houston Astros at the time. But I don't remember that conversation whatsoever.
Are you saying that you don't remember it, or are you telling us that you didn't have it? Do you know? And the reason why I'm asking you that is because we're dealing with some serious matters here, and I want to give you wanted a fair chance to address this committee, and I'm just wondering, are you telling us under oath that it didn't happen, or you're saying you just don't remember?
I don't remember that, and again, I'll address the any conversation about my wife, Debbie, using HGH. I know that at one point she read a USA Today article about that. I don't know the year. It sure could have been 2005 when this article came about, and they just, it was just general talk.
All right.
About HGH.
Let me go on. Laura Pettit also has a clear recollection of being told about this conversation by her husband. Let me read what she wrote. A few years later, I believe in 2005, Andy again told me of a conversation with Roger Clemens about HGH. Andy told me that he had been thinking that if a reporter asked him, he would tell the reporter of his own use of HGH in 2002. He said that he told Roger Clemens this and asked Roger what he would say if asked. Andy told me that in the 2005 conversation, Roger denied using HGH and told Andy that Andy was mistaken about their earlier conversation. According to Andy, Roger said that it was his wife, Debbie, who used HGH. Now, the timeline is very important here. According to Mr. Pettit, his first conversation with you, Mr. Clemens, occurred in 1999 or 2000. But you told us that your wife did not use HGH until 2003. That makes it impossible that you could have been referring to your wife's use of HGH in the first conversation. These aren't the only relevant conversations that Mr. Pettit told us about. He told us that after his first conversation with you, Mr. Clemens, he spoke with Mr. McNamee. Let me read let me read to you again that affidavit. And I quote, shortly after my conversation with Roger, I spoke with Brian McNamee. Only he and I were parties to the conversation. I asked Roger about HGH and told him that Roger said he had used it. Brian McNamee became angry. He told me that Roger should not have told me about his use of HGH because it was supposed to be confidential. Mr. McNamee, do you remember that conversation?
Yes, sir.
Did it happen?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Cummings, your time has expired.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Davis for 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good news is everybody, I think, understands the dangers of steroids and HGH, and I think it's the one thing both of you agree on. Mr. McNamee, let me start with you, just because they've asked all their questions, Mr. Clemens. I have questions for both of you. You mentioned in your earlier statement how the number of times that you injected the players has constantly risen every time you've testified somewhere. You've alleged that Mr. Clemens' steroid use to at least 5 groups of people: your lawyers, federal agents, Senator Mitchell and his staff, private investigators for Mr. Clemens, and then our staff during depositions. Why has the number continued to change if we're coming clean each time?
Thank you for the question. The beginning of the investigation with the federal government, as I didn't know what questions they were going to ask me about specific players and injections, I had no recollection of the amounts of times, because it wasn't part of my regimen where I would mark it down. It was pretty much, done by the players. They would tell me when and I would do it, but it came because I downplayed it to the beginning, where I didn't want to hurt the players, even though I told the truth about their injections and their use. And then as I lived this for the last 2 months, and then I had realized, as I said in my opening statement, about the regimens. There were specific different types of regimens for testosterone, winstrol, and growth hormone, that I started to think more about it. Even though I can't be accurate, these are just ballpark numbers, or best guesstimate as far as lower end, high end, as I thought about the regimen over time.
I mean, the ballpark for Knobloch went from 7 to 9 times to 50 times.
Yes, you have to understand, every time I met, sir, with investigators, Senator Mitchell, with the congressional panel, I had more time to think about it, and the regimen for growth hormone was 4 times a week. So then I just did the math.
You didn't, okay. So you didn't keep any records or anything? This is just going back?
Every time I met,
collection.
each individual time, did it go up? Anything change? Everything go up? And I was specifically living this every single day, as opposed to I didn't think about it for years.
Did you re-inform the federal government about these changes as you went forward to the federal prosecutors?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Clemens, shortly after your call, and I'm going to ask some questions about the January 4th call between you and Mr. McNamee. Shortly after your call with Brian McNamee on Friday, January 4th, you sent him an email. In the email, you very clearly tell Mr. McNamee there's nothing to talk about unless he admits he is lying. Did you ever get a response to this email?
I'm sorry?
To the email, did you ever get a response to your email to Mr. McNamee on Friday, January 4th, where you, this was after your phone call?
Congressman, after the phone call that was taped, I believe I sent an email back to him saying that unless you're going to come forward and tell the truth,
Right.
we have nothing to say.
Did he ever respond?
He did not.
That's what I'm asking.
I don't believe he did.
During the phone call, Mr. McNamee, during that call that you had with Mr. Clemens, Mr. Clemens said, "I just need you to come out and tell the truth," and you didn't respond. Why didn't you just tell Mr. Clemens during the course of that conversation, Roger, I did tell the truth. I had to tell the truth. I'm not trying to hurt anybody. That's all you needed to say in this conversation. This was a conversation between the two of you. It seems to me this would have been a time where if this was a friend and you felt pained about having to expose him, you would have said, Roger, I had to tell the truth. Why in that conversation didn't you say that?
Because at the state of that conversation, I realized that it was being taped, and I also didn't know if anyone else was listening. So I also was trying not to hurt him if it wasn't just him taping me. But if you listen to it and you know my jargon, I did say that. It is what it is.
And how in your jargon did you say that?
I said it is what it is, meaning that I did tell the truth.
And you knew it was, for posterity and everything else, I would have thought this would have been a good opportunity for you to step forward. But you were afraid of hurting others at this point.
I was afraid of hurting Roger Clemens.
In your testimony, Mr. McNamee, in your testimony about 2001, you added an additional substance, parabolin, on the list of steroids you injected into Mr. Clemens. You didn't tell Senator Mitchell about that. Is that, again, because you weren't focused on that at the time and you hadn't had time to think about it?
That's accurate, sir. It wasn't until, I don't remember actually that question being asked, if it was there any other steroids being injected by anybody else except for the congressional panel. And I thought about it, and it just, like increasing the numbers of injections, it came to me that parabolin was also another steroid used by Mr. Clemens.
You testified in your deposition that Mr. Clemens, on one occasion, bled through his designer pants, and a player noticed it, and that's when you bought Band-Aids. There weren't a lot of blood. There wasn't a lot of blood a lot of times, but since he was wearing his dress pants, he bled through, and Mike Stanton had noticed it and made a comment. So he always traveled now with those little Band-Aids for his butt if he bled, and that's your quote. He said something to Roger about growth hormone. I think it was Stanton started taking growth hormone, and he said something knowing that. And I walked right into Roger, just turned around to Stanton and said, hey, man, whatever I can do to get the edge. And Stanton was asking him, thinking I told him he was taking steroids or growth hormone, etc. Do you recall any, and let me ask this, Mr. Clemens, do you recall any bleeding through your pants in 2001?
I don't.
You recall Mike Stanton never talking to you about growth hormone?
And I don't, and I had no knowledge that Mike Stanton was using growth hormone.
You recall him asking you about blood on your pants?
No.
Do you recall saying anything to Mr. Stanton about getting an edge, even as a joke? Could that have occurred?
When Congressman, when I'm on the mound, I want an edge.
Yeah.
So
Let me ask you, Mr. McNamee, could you describe that a little clearer, what happened at that point?
Involving Mr. Stanton?
Well, the incident involving him and bleeding through the pants, and how often this happened? Or was this
my
one
best,
occurrence?
excuse me. My best recollection was that I didn't witness Mr. Stanton witness him bleeding through his pants. It was just a comment that Mr. Clements had told me. That's why he started buying Band-Aids, those little Band-Aids to cover up any blood that might bleed. And on a separate occasion, if not the same occasion on the plane, I had walked into Mr. Stanton talking to Roger about growth hormone, and I was upset that I believe that Mike Stanton duped Roger into thinking I had told Stanton about his growth hormone use, and Roger's response was, "I'll do anything to take an edge." And I didn't respond to it, and I was upset.
So
that
you didn't witness any of this? This was
I witnessed the conversation as Roger had turned around and said, I'll do whatever it does to get an edge. And then I figured out, because I also trained Mike Stanton on a somewhat one-on-one basis, that the conversation that he duped him into telling him because I wouldn't tell Stanton.
Okay. Did Stanton use steroids?
I know he used growth hormone, yes.
Okay. Did you tell the Mitchell report that?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. The Mitchell report talks about the party at Jose Canseco's house on or about June 8th through 10th, 1998. This was toward the end of the road trip. It included a Marlins series after the Blue Jays returned home to Toronto. This is allegedly Mr. Clemens then approached you and for the first time brought up the subject of steroid. I think that was your testimony. I want to ask some questions about that, because the Canseco barbecue is a key event in 1998 where your testimonies differ significantly. You described the barbecue as potentially the time and place where Roger Clemens comes into possession of anabolic steroids. You told us in your deposition you have a vivid recollection of Clemens being at the barbecue. Do you stand by that?
Yes, sir.
Now, all the evidence that the committee's obtained goes the other way. For example, Jose Canseco completed an affidavit and was interviewed by the staff. He said he remembers the barbecue as if it were yesterday. Canseco says Clemens was not there. He remembers being disappointed that Mr. Clemens wasn't there. He specifically remembers having his high school baseball coach at the barbecue and being disappointed that he was unable to introduce the coach to Clemens. Canseco's affidavit reads, on Tuesday, June 9th, 1998, I hosted a barbecue at my house for my teammates and other Blue Jays staff members. It was an honor for me to host a luncheon for my new team. During that luncheon, there were approximately 30 to 40 people present. I specifically recall that Clemens did not come to the barbecue. I remember this because I was disappointed that he did not attend. According to news reports, Blue Jays catcher at the time, Darren Fletcher, doesn't remember seeing Clemens there. The Blue Jays trainer at the time, Tommy Craig and Scott Shannon, told us they don't remember Clemens being at the barbecue. The Blue Jays traveling secretary at the time specifically remembers Clemens not being on the team bus that traveled to the barbecue and does not remember Clemens being there. Mr. Canseco's wife at the time, the then Jessica Canseco, now Jessica Fisher, has supplied an affidavit to the committee that she does not remember Clemens being there. And audio from the television broadcast of 2 different games during the 3-game series has the announcers talking about the barbecue and how Roger Clemens did not attend. And Mr. Clemens has produced a golf receipt showing that he played golf that day. Now, how do you explain you're the only person that remembers him that day, and is that a critical juncture?
I don't think it's that critical in regards to Mr. Clemens' steroid use, but I guess as far as asking me, is it critical in my recollection, I have 2 distinct memories of that party, and one of them is as I was eating a sandwich next to Mr. Canseco's pool by myself, I noticed a young child running towards the pool. And as I looked up, there was a woman chasing after the young child, and she was wearing a peach bikini with green in it with board shorts. She was a thin, probably mid to late 30s woman, and she grabbed the child, who was about 2 years old at the time, if not younger. And I later found out from one of the ball players, I said, "Who's that?" And they said, "It's Roger's nanny." And then I had turned around to see Roger and Debbie Clemens talking in the middle, and then they went inside the house. I did believe I said hello to Roger, and I know Roger showed up a little bit later. And I also have,
How do you know he showed up later? Because you saw him later?
I saw him there at the house of Jose Canseco's, and I believe we've had numerous conversations about how great that party would have been if it wasn't for the fact that we had a game that night, and all we had was sandwiches and iced tea, because Jose had a really nice house.
Mr. Clemens, your golf receipt that day is time-stamped 8:58. Do you recall what time you teed off?
Well, the time I would get out of the pro shop and get ready to tee off, it had been a good 30, 40 minutes probably. The time was 8, again, I'm sorry?
8:58, so it would have been after 9 that you would have teed off.
Yeah.
How long does it generally take you to play around?
It'd be 4, every bit of 4 hours, 4.5, depending on
How
the
far
traffic.
was the golf course from Mr. Canseco's house? Any idea?
I wouldn't think it was 20 minutes at best.
Did you eat lunch after your round of golf that day? Do you remember?
I don't remember.
You pitched 7 innings the night before. What would have been your pattern in practice on the day after pitching? What time would you ordinarily show up at the ballpark the day after you started?
The day after is, well, obviously the day after I enjoy playing golf. I usually enjoy playing golf the day before I pitch and the day after when I can. I like the, obviously getting outdoors anytime I can, especially when we're on the road. I do not like hanging in the hotel room.
The night before the barbecue, the Blue Jays lost 4-3 in 17 innings. Does that ring a bell? Does that?
It does,
help
and
refresh your-
you said earlier I threw that game, so obviously there was no decision involved, I would imagine.
Were your wife and children in Miami for this series?
Yes.
Okay. You think you might have gone on on to the barbecue after golf?
I don't remember his party.
Okay. Is it possible your wife and some of your kids could have gone without you?
I believe my wife, Debbie, was in my golf foursome, and the kids sure could have been.
Okay.
I don't remember that they were.
But you don't remember being there at all?
I don't.
Okay. The reason I asked that is because it was this was brought up, and this was the beginning, I think, of as I look at the testimony of your starting to ask about these questions right at that time or right thereafter. We've also spoken to a number of medical professionals inside and outside of baseball. This is about the vitamin B12 shots, and I know a lot of players seem to take it. We had a hearing on this yesterday. Most of them say B12 is not beneficial unless you have a dire medical need for it, like if you had anemia. What's your experience been through injecting B12?
I was encouraged to take B12 all the way back since 1988. My mother encouraged me to take B12. I think it's beneficial. I take vitamins every other day. I take B12 in the tablet form. I take vitamin E. I take a multivitamin, again, just about every other day. And I think it was most common if anybody was sick on the team or if your energy felt run down and so on and so forth. I don't know the technical benefits for it, but I've always assumed that it was a good thing to have.
Did you inject yourself with B12, or did Mr. McNamee ever inject you, or do you remember?
I've never injected myself. Mr. McNamee's given me 3 shots of, when we were in Toronto, 3 shots of B12, 2 in New York.
Okay. Mr. McNamee, do you concur with that?
The first time I heard of Roger taking B12 was on 60 Minutes. I've never given Roger Clemens B12 and never heard of B12 really before.
Is my time up? All right.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Chair recognizes Mr. Tierney for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my questions, I guess, are going to be a little bit about who's telling the truth here as well. I have questions for both Mr. McNamee and Mr. Clemens about whether or not they've been telling the truth to us or to investigators. Okay. Mr. McNamee, let me start with you if we could. We know that in some previous investigations you haven't always been honest. You were involved in a criminal investigation in Florida in 2001. You told committee investigators that you provided the police in that investigation with statements that were not truthful. Mr. McNamee, were you truthful to government investigators in Florida in 2001?
No, sir.
You also told the committee that you withheld information from federal prosecutors who were investigating the steroid use by professional baseball players. You didn't give prosecutors the whole truth about the number of injections that you gave Mr. Knobloch and Mr. Clemens, and you now say that there were more injections than you previously admitted to. And you withheld physical evidence, syringes, needles, and gauze pads that you claim you used to inject Mr. Clemens in 2001. Mr. McNamee, were you truthful to federal investigators last year?
No, sir.
Why did you mislead the investigators?
The part about the injections were part recollection and part withholding, trying not to hurt these players. And about the evidence, once again, I really felt bad for the situation that I was in. I felt bad for having to be confronted with the federal investigators and Senator Mitchell. But everything I told them about their use was true.
Well, I think it's important we establish that on the record. You've admitted credibility problems in the past, and I think that we have to keep that in mind as we move forward. But Mr. Clemens, let me turn to you,
Yes.
if I might. I know you've been visiting members of Congress recently, and members seem to have been impressed by your apparent credibility in person. But we know that some of the things you told us with great earnestness appear to not be accurate. And this raises the questions about your own credibility. Let me read to you from page 66 of your deposition.
Okay.
You were asked, did you ever speak with Mr. McNamee about human growth hormone? And you answered, I have not. Then you were asked, never asked him any questions about it? And you answered, never asked him. You were then asked the question a third time. The question was, do you recall a specific instance where you did speak with Mr. McNamee about HGH? And your answer was, I don't remember. The only thing I remember about the topic was there was an article or show about some elderly men that had a curve in his spine, and then later on in the show he was able to play golf, and that's basically the conversation we had. When you gave those answers in your deposition, you seemed earnest, you seemed credible, according to those that were questioning you, much like you do today. Were your answers truthful?
Yes, they were.
With respect to you, we know that you didn't give the committee the truthful answers much later in your deposition then, because you were asked whether any members of your family had taken HGH. In answering that question later in your deposition, you told the committee staff about two specific conversations that you had with Mr. McNamee about HGH. So I want to walk you through that testimony about the time your wife was injected with HGH by Mr. McNamee. At the outset, there doesn't appear to be any dispute between you and Mr. McNamee about whether your wife, Debbie Clemens, was injected with HGH by Mr. McNamee in 2003. You both told the committee about this in your depositions, but you gave very different accounts of what actually happened. Mr. Clemens, according to your account, Mr. McNamee injected your wife in your bedroom without your knowledge. Here's what you said on page 174 of your deposition. I was not present at the time. I found out later in the evening, and the reason I found out, she was telling me that something was going on with the circulation, and this concerned me. You also said on page 176 of your deposition, the next day she still was not feeling comfortable, something about her circulation. You told us you had a very strong reaction. You told us you were so concerned about what happened that you searched some luggage of Mr. McNamee that he had stored in your house looking for other evidence of drugs. Do I have that right so far?
That is correct, sir, yes.
You then told us about two specific conversations you had with Mr. McNamee about your wife and HGH. The first happened that night when you called him on the telephone. So let me read that part of the transcript to you. That's on page 174.
I don't have it.
You said, we had a pretty heated discussion about it, that I don't know enough about it, and that we don't know enough about it. You then told the committee, I also called him the next day because she still was not feeling comfortable, something about her circulation. I wasn't happy about it. I said, we don't know anything about this. He says it's legal. There's no law against it. Now, Mr. Clemens, you told the committee that you had had no conversations with Mr. McNamee about HGH. You did that 3 times in the early part of your deposition. But your own statements now show that you had 2 specific and memorable conversations with him about HGH. So when you were asked on 3 specific occasions, why didn't you tell the committee about those conversations when you were asked, did you ever speak with Mr. McNamee about human growth hormone?
Prior to he injecting my wife, Mr. Congressman, we had no conversation about HGH in any substance or any detail whatsoever. And definitely, again, I'm going to read a statement from my wife here in just a minute, but we never discussed HGH in detail. I go back to, again, Andy Pettit. If I was a part of using HGH or a user of HGH, Brian McNamee would have come told me that Andy was a part of this. I'm certain, again, I would have known about all this.
Well, help us
If
out,
I-
Mr. Clemens, if I might. Later in your depositions, when you talked about your wife, the early part of your deposition, 3 times, in very clear and unambiguous questions and answers, did you ever speak with Mr. McNamee about human growth hormone? I have not. The question, did you ever? Second time, you said you never asked him about any questions. You answered, never asked him. The third time, do you recall a specific instance where you did speak with Mr. McNamee about HGH? You said, I don't remember. Then later on, you go to recall 2 very specific conversations. How do you reconcile 3 times saying you didn't, and then later when somebody specifically finally asks you about your wife, you have a recollection of 2 very distinct and memorable conversations?
Mr. Congressman, again, I never had any detailed discussions with Brian McNamee about HGH.
Well, didn't you call him on the phone after your wife had told you that she had taken HGH?
That very much is detailed conversation.
It certainly is.
And it sure is. And if I may,
Well, I just want to know if you can reconcile that. How do you say 3 times that you never did speak to him about it, and then later on acknowledge that, in fact, you had a pretty heated conversation, you said?
very heated conversation about it. And again, prior to that, we had not had discussions about HGH.
But, Mr. Clemens, the questions early morning hadn't been prior to your wife's. The questions were, had you ever? And you can see where that leads us to some credibility issues here. You 3 times said never, and then only when somebody really presses you on a specific incident you have a recollection of 2 memorable conversations.
And again, prior to, Mr. Congressman, we had no detailed discussion about HGH.
Prior to what?
During my testimony with the committee, and I believe the committee ran down when they were asking me the question about front office people, other employees, and that's when they said family on the question.
That's all helpful, Mr. Clemens. That these questions, I'm reading to you right from the transcript, what you're referring to now happened later.
That's
All
correct.
The 3 distinct questions were specifically about whether you ever spoke with Mr. McNamee, and 3 times you said never. Right? Later, somebody brought up the fact about your wife, and that's the inconsistency that we have. Let me go on a little bit. It's not the only area where we have some question, because I'll read to you another excerpt from your deposition.
Okay.
You were asked, it's on page 67 if you want,
I
did
don't
you
know.
do any research on your own about human growth hormone? And you answered, no, I haven't. I've never researched it. I couldn't tell you the first thing about it. Seems a little difficult to believe. You testified that your wife was injected by Mr. McNamee without your knowledge of HGH. She didn't feel well and started to have circulation problems. You felt so strongly about what Mr. McNamee had done that you searched his luggage to make sure there were no drugs in the house. What did your doctor say about this?
I talked to Deborah about calling our doctor, and she said that she was just feeling very uncomfortable, and in her words, wigged out about it. And not only did the reason I searched his luggage for the fact that he would always leave luggage behind and have us mail out his luggage and leave without his luggage at my house, no differently than when I spoke to him about bringing alcohol onto my property. I had young kids. That is the conversation that was about. I was comfortable with my wife's reaction.
She told you she had circulation problems,
She felt that she was having circulation problems, yes.
but you never called a doctor. Certainly it seems to most reasonable people, I think, that if that were the case, your wife told you that she was having a reaction, circulation problems, and particularly if it was administered by a fitness trainer without your knowledge, that you would have called a doctor to find out what the consequences were. You never did that.
We did not, and I did talk to Deb about that, if we should call our doctor.
What steps did you take to learn about the effects of HGH after you learned that your wife had taken the injection?
I didn't take a lot of steps, Mr. Congressman. In the last 2 months since this has been going on, I've learned more about HGH than I ever thought. I still don't know enough about it. I don't know. I've heard that. I've seen things on TV that these guys talk about how it helps them, actors and different things of that nature. I don't know anything about it.
Well, I guess
Gentlemen.
that's where the question comes in. If I might, just, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Clemens, you want us to believe that Mr. McNamee injected your wife without your knowledge, that she started suffering serious side effects of the drug, that you were upset enough to call Mr. McNamee and then search his luggage, But despite all that, you never made inquiry of a doctor, and you never even looked up to see what the effects might be. Is that right?
Mr. Congressman, I don't believe I ever said serious effects. She said she was having itching and she had some type of circulation problem that she was feeling.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair yields to Mr. Davis 10 minutes to control.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The tapes of the Toronto Blue Jays Florida Marlin game has several comments on it about Mr. Clemens not being at that Canseco party, and Mr. Canseco provided a sworn affidavit stating that Clemens did not attend that party, and you indicated that he came to the party late. How do you square that with what was on television, on the radio, and what the sworn affidavit of Canseco's was? I mean, there's some inconsistency there.
My recollection is not inconsistent. What they said, I recall Roger Clemens being at that party.
Why did you keep those gauze pads?
I'm sorry?
Why did you keep the needles in the gauze pads?
Like I had mentioned in my opening statement.
Well, I want to read to you what you said in the sworn testimony, okay? And this was 2000, 2001 that these pads were accumulated, right?
2001, 2002, sir.
Okay, 2001, 2002. And you worked for Clemens up until what, 2006?
2007.
2007, so you stayed with him 5 years after you kept these materials, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I want to read this to you. It says, I kept them well because throughout my time with Roger Clemens, it was there always somewhat in the back of my mind that I distrusted him to a degree. And my gut feeling and the fact that I was an ex-cop, I just felt that, and I think there were bits and pieces coming out in the paper. Why in the world would you work for somebody that you thought was unethical and would lie, and why would you keep this information for 5 years if he was your friend and you thought that he was to be distrusted?
He was my employer.
You do this to all your employers? I mean, is this the kind of employee you was, to keep gauze pads and needles and everything for 5 years and go on and keep working for them?
Well, it wasn't something that I thought about. It was just there, and it kept coming up. It was in the basement, and as I had thought about it, more things came up. And as you saw in 2000, I wrote an article in the New York Times regarding the more stuff that kept coming out about steroid use in baseball. So for the fact that I never felt good about what I was doing, the fact that it was illegal, I figured because I've done things before for other people and have got hurt by it, I might as well hold on to these things. And it wasn't something I dwelled on.
How many other people did you treat that you kept their gauze pads and needles?
Possibly one other.
And who was that?
Chuck Knobloch.
Do you still have them?
I believe it's in the possession of the federal government.
Yeah. Why did you not give those to the Mitchell Report Committee immediately when you were contacted by them?
Because I felt horrible about being in the position that I was in.
I want to make sure I got this straight. Your friend, Roger Clemens, you allegedly gave him these shots. You kept the pads and the needles for 5 years and went on and kept working for him because he was your employer. And then you said you felt bad. You felt bad about proposing and giving these to the Mitchell Committee when you first started talking to them?
Yes, sir.
Gee whiz, are you kidding me?
No, sir.
My goodness. Yeah, and as I understand it from my colleague here, you told the New York Times that you had no direct proof at the beginning of this investigation, right?
I'm sorry?
You told the New York Times that you had no direct evidence like the gauze and needles at the beginning of all this.
I didn't talk to the New York Times. I told the federal investigators and the Mitchell people that I had no direct evidence as far as physical evidence.
January 5th, 2008. What's that? So you didn't tell the truth then initially to them?
No, sir.
You lied.
Yes, sir.
Okay. There's several things here that really bother me. First of all, you lied about him being at Canseco. Canseco said he wasn't there in a sworn affidavit. On the radio and on television, they said he wasn't there. And yet you still maintain that he did come there. And now you admit you lied about this. Are you lying about anything else? I mean, why don't you tell us?
No, sir, and I'm not lying about Jose Canseco's house.
So you just lie when it's convenient for you.
No, sir.
Yeah. What's that? Yeah, can you pull the microphone a little bit closer, please? Mr. Clemens, in your defamation lawsuit against McNamee, it says that according to McNamee, he originally made his allegations to federal authorities after being threatened with criminal prosecution if he did not implicate you. That's an allegation of coercion. Why do you consider McNamee trustworthy on this point, and how do you have this kind of information that he might have been coerced into his testimony?
What I've heard on different occasions about what he said and what he hasn't said, there was a tape that I heard. The timeline would have been 4 or 5 days before the report came out. It was a taped conversation from Jim Murray. And that's basically where I heard the allegations that were being said by Brian McNamee about myself and Andy Pettit also, which, again, that's the first time that I heard Andy Pettit's name, and about using HGH, I said, absolutely no way. Of course, now that I've learned that Andy has done it, I was shocked.
Mr. McNamee, I'm going to read to you a series of prior statements attributed to you regarding steroid use or the lack thereof by Mr. Clemens or Mr. Pettit. I never gave Clemens or Pettit steroids. They never asked me for steroids. The only thing they asked me for were vitamins. That was William Sherman and T.J. Quinn. Andy totes baggage to Bronx, New York Daily News, December 10th, 2006. Did you say that?
Yes, I did.
Is that a lie?
Yes, it is.
Oh, it's another one. Okay. I told federal investigators twice that Roger and Andy had nothing to do with it. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Is that a lie?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I said, Roger and Andy, you know what? You have to talk to them. I don't know anything about that. I don't know anything about that. Transcript of interview by Jim Yarbrough and Billy Beck. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, please?
I said, Roger and Andy, you know what? You have to talk to them. I don't know anything about that. I don't know anything about that. That's a transcript of the interview by Jim Yarbrough and Billy Belk and Brian McNamee, December 12, 2007. Is that correct?
I'm not sure. What are you referring to? What am I saying I don't know anything about? Sir.
Let me read you. Well, let's pass on that because I'm sorry? Oh, this is a quote you told the investigators. We'll pass on that. Mr. McNamee, I'm going to read you a series of statements attributed to you regarding your involvement with steroids. I don't have any dealings with steroids or amphetamines. I don't buy it, sell it, condone it, or recommend it. I don't make money from it. It's not part of my livelihood and not part of my business. Did you say that?
Yep.
That's a lie, right?
Partial.
Partial?
Partial lie.
McNamee pleads guilty to knowing the ins and outs of steroids, but says, I have no involvement as far as supplying it, getting it, selling it, telling them to use it. John Heyman, the sixth man, Clemens' trainer, denies link to Grimsley Lug. Is that a lie?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You know, I'm not going to read any more of this. This is really disgusting. You're here as a sworn witness. You're here to tell the truth. You're here under oath. And yet we have lie after lie after lie after lie, where you've told this committee and the people of this country that Roger Clemens did things that I don't know what to believe. I know one thing I don't believe, and that's you. The other thing I want to say is that, and I want to say this about this whole investigation. You know, Donovan, who was the Secretary of Labor, was accused of wrongdoing and went to trial. And he was found innocent within about 20 minutes. And he came out and said, how do I get my reputation back? You know, Roger Clemens, unless it's proven that he used steroids, and so far I haven't seen anything like it. If he did, he ought to be held accountable. But Roger Clemens is a baseball, he's a titan in baseball. And you, and with all these lies, if they're not true, are destroying him and his reputation. Now, how does he get his reputation back? if this is not true? And how can we believe you because you've lied and lied and lied and lied? And the thing I want to say is that we have this penchant in the country of trial by media. I mean, I understand the media has the right to come to these things and to get all the information that they can. But until, in this country, until a man is proven guilty, he's innocent. And this kind of a hearing and this kind of a circus that I call it really bothers me. If he's done something wrong, he ought to be indicted, he ought to be prosecuted, and he ought to be punished for it. But I don't see any evidence of that so far. And with that, I'll stop.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes gentleman from Massachusetts for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member. Since the testimony is so contradictory in this case, I'd like to at least refer to some of the physical evidence that we have before the committee. Mr. Clemens, early in the investigation, you provided the committee with a transcript of a secretly taped interview conducted by two of your investigators. The interview was with Brian McNamee, and it took place at Mr. McNamee's home on December 12, 2007. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. During the interview, Mr. McNamee, you told investigators that that you had injected Mr. Clemens with Winstrol, a steroid, in 1998, and your exact testimony is that, well, actually, that he probably developed an abscess on his buttocks as a result of the injection, and you said, quote, "It was probably my fault because Winstrol, I learned later that you're not supposed to inject it quickly. You're supposed to do it very slowly. That way it dispenses slowly. If you do it quickly, then it settles in a pool of fat, and that is how an abscess is formed, and that's what happened. So it was probably my fault." Now, being under oath today, is that basically correct as far as your testimony goes regarding that incident?
Yes, sir.
Okay. In pursuit of further information on this, we in the committee asked for medical records during this time period. And a medical record from July 28, 1998 was provided by the Toronto Blue Jays at the time that said that there was a palpable mass, quote unquote, on the right buttock of Mr. Clemens. On another record, it also noticed a similar mass on the left buttock. And the July 28th record said also that Roger received a B12 injection approximately 7 to 10 days ago into his right buttock from Dr. Taylor at the Sky Dome. So we brought in Dr. Taylor and asked him some questions about this. He said that he did give a B12 shot to Mr. Clemens, but he could not remember exactly when. We also asked Mr. Clemens about it, and in his previous testimony he said, "It says right here Dr. Taylor had given me a B12 shot, so that surely could have happened." Mr. Clemens, you also told us that the palpable mass could have had other causes. For example, you said that a muscle strain, which you called a strained glute, could have led to the problem. The medical records indicated that after the July 28 diagnosis, Mr. Clemens was sent to have an MRI, and this MRI was not provided in the original set of documents that the committee received. And in fact, it was not easy for the committee to obtain the MRI from counsel for Mr. Clemens, and repeated requests were made for this MRI, and we only received the MRI report on Monday, after the committee informed counsel for Mr. Clemens that the committee would consider stronger options if the document were not provided to the committee voluntarily. The MRI report provides important additional information about the injury to Mr. Clement and the palpable mass on his buttocks. According to the report, and I quote, "The injury was, quote, likely related to the patient's prior attempted intramuscular injections." I want to repeat that. It says it was likely related to the patient's prior attempted intramuscular injections. And to get more insight into the significance of this MRI, we actually stripped the name. We redacted the report from the records and provided them to the chief of musculoskeletal radiology at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, Dr. Mark Murphy. He is one of the country's leading experts on MRI. And we asked him to review the records and give us his opinion. He issued a report, which I'd like to make part of the hearing record. The MRI report...
Without objection, that'll be the order.
The MRI report we received says that the injury, and this is a quote from Dr. Murphy, it says it was likely related to the patient's prior attempted intramuscular injections. And Mr. Murphy agreed with that, Dr. Murphy agreed with that diagnosis. He said that the MRI showed that the muscles of the buttocks showed no strain or trauma, so he concluded the injury was not a strained muscle. Next, he gave his opinion about whether the injury was more likely caused by B12, as you've asserted, or steroids, as Mr. McNamee claims. And to be fair, Dr. Murphy stated that he could not be definitive without seeing the films, and he cautioned that the patient's reaction can vary. He said it wasn't a true abscess, but he did say this, and this is a quote: "It is my opinion that the history and the MR imaging descriptions are more compatible with the Rinstrol injection, as the inflammatory component is prominent by report."
Mr. Chairman, I know it's highly irregular. May I ask counsel to Roger Clemens please address the point of the congressman for 1 moment, please?
The rules of the committee provide that counsel may advise their clients but not speak directly to the hearing itself.
Well, Mr. Chairman,
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I would request that I be permitted, given the
I'm
fact...
sorry, the rules don't provide it. Please talk to your client and have him answer any questions that are outstanding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Reclaiming my time, if I may. During our investigation, we also asked Dr. Taylor about whether he thought the B12 shot that he gave to Mr. Clemens could have caused the mass on his buttocks. He told us that this was unlikely. He stated that he had given close to 1,000 B12 shots in his medical career, and they had never seen a complication like the one presented with Mr. Clemens. The head trainer, we also questioned Tommy Craig, the head trainer. He also told he had never seen a side effect like the one exhibited by Mr. Clemens from a B12 shot in 30 years as a trainer. As well, we asked the assistant trainer, Scott Shannon, in a career of almost 20 years. He said that he had never seen a B12 shot cause that kind of reaction. Based on the MRI results, it also appears definitive that the mass was not caused by a strained glute or other muscle strain. In addition, we have Mr. Canseco's testimony that on numerous occasions he had conversations with Mr. Clemens regarding cycling and stacking of steroids as well. Given the physical testimony, the physical evidence that we've had there that seems to be consistent with much of what Mr. McNamee is saying, Mr. Clemens, how am I supposed to receive this testimony as someone who's simply looking for the truth and looking it to be supported by the physical evidence? This is not supportive of your claim. Much of this is supportive of Mr. McNamee's assertions. And I just want, as someone who went through all of this, I want you to explain to me the import of this evidence. How can this all be wrong? Help me here.
Mr. Chairman, could I just ask a second? He's inserted into the record a report by Dr. Murphy. We'd ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a report by Dr. Bert W. O'Malley, professor and chair of molecular and cellular biology.
Mr. Davis,
we comes to a much different conclusion.
Yeah, we will take whatever you want into the record, but this is Mr. Lynch's time.
Okay.
Congressman Lynch, if I may, from what I understand, we provided everything that we could possibly provide to the staff. We fully cooperated with everything that was asked of us. I know, obviously, by looking at the medical records, I got a B12 shot, and it obviously gave me some discomfort. I hate to get on Dr. Taylor, who gave the shot, but if he gave me a bad shot, he gave me a bad shot. I don't know how to explain that, but looking at my medical records and fully cooperated. You know, anytime I need an MRI, I've had many MRIs on my body, so again, I don't have any idea. I don't know who the gentleman is that you're expressing this today, but all I can tell you is what I know by my medical reports. We've had a Dr. O'Malley review everything, and he concludes there was no steroids. So I'm doing every due diligent thing that I can possibly think of, and giving the staff everything that I could possibly think of to look wherever they need to look about this subject. So I've not heard that we weren't cooperating on giving you everything that you could possibly need to look into this in any way, shape, or form.
Well, and again, there was difficulty. Some of the information came over quite readily. It was difficult to obtain others, especially this MRI report. But let's get back
Well, Mr.
to the simple fact that
You'll have to conclude. Your time has expired.
okay. This is not the report of some unknown physician that we're contesting here. This is the reports of Dr. Taylor. This is the reports of the trainer, Mr. Shannon, and others who have said that Scott Shannon, Dr. Ron Taylor, and Melvin Thomas Craig. These are people who are very familiar with this. There's probably 60 years of experience here in giving B12 shots.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Davis.
Yeah, thank you. I'd
wanted
ask
to,
unanimous consent that a commission study looking at the same MRI records done by Bert W. O'Malley, MD, professor and chair of molecular and cellular biology at Baylor University, be admitted into the record.
Was this given to you by Mr. Clemens?
It was. They had this done.
Without objection, the request will be
I mean, practically, I think asking Mr. Clemens to answer a medical technical question like this isn't fair on a report he's never seen before. This was just made available to our side this morning.
That's
for the
correct,
record.
Mr. Congressman.
Gentlemen from Virginia is recognized in this 10-minute round.
I'd also note that Alan Gross, who was the doctor who ordered the MRI and actually is the only doctor here who viewed Mr. Clemens' injury himself, gave a deposition to the committee that will be released this afternoon under oath, and he came to a much different conclusion. He didn't even see an abscess at that point. The only reason he ordered an MRI is because this was Roger Clemens. This was the franchise, and if you see a bruise on your star player, you're going to go get an MRI, and you're not taking any chances. And there was zero evidence at that point, or even suspicion, that drugs or anything had caused this, and that deposition, I said, will be released this afternoon. So, listen, I will just say this was literally a new definition of lynching with the last question that came in asking Mr. Clemens a technical medical question like this on a report that he had never had the opportunity to see before. He's not a doctor.
Well, evidently his lawyers were able to get a report for you to give for the record on that issue, so you're not completely taken by surprise.
That was an exhibit that they've had before this committee for Mr. Waxman for weeks.
Mr. Chairman, out of respect, I believe the committee got the report also.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. They've had
sure
it.
I've given.
This has been part of your submissions. That's nothing. There's no surprises here. You didn't give this to us special. We just pulled it out of the records. Because I don't think this really tells anybody. None of these doctors physically looked at you. They're looking at an MRI and taking a different view. And I'm just saying the doctor who looked at this originally came to a much different conclusion. People can judge whatever they want, but I think what's fair is fair on this. Mr. McNamee, let me just return to you since the other side seems to be focused on Mr. Clemens. At your deposition, you testified that one of your alleged injections of Winstrol went wrong. Is that correct?
I'm not saying one of them. I'm just relating that that I did it too fast, that it could relate to this abscess.
Yeah.
Which one, I'm not sure.
I think it was the one in the Tampa Bay clubhouse. Does that ring a bell?
I know I mentioned that, but I didn't know when that trip took place.
Well, I'm just trying to get into this abscess question. Okay,
Yes,
that's not as important. Now, when you said that when you inject Winstrol too quickly, one of the risks is having an abscess form. Is that correct?
That's what I believe.
Okay. And you said that you thought that Mr. Clemens developed an abscess?
I was told by the head trainer that he developed an abscess.
You said that head trainer Tommy Craig told you that?
Yes, sir.
You said Clemens came to you around this time and said something along the lines of get rid of this stuff. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. A little bit after his treatment for the abscess, he had come to me and said that.
And you interpreted to get rid of this stuff, meaning he did not want to use Winstrol.
He
That was your
threw it
interpretation?
in my locker, and he said, get rid of this stuff. So, yes.
You said there was a good portion left of the season when he stopped using Winstrol.
That was my recollection.
Now, if you go back and look at the Blue Jays' schedule for 1998, the team was in Tampa, where, under your testimony, you noted that it was Tampa. The testimony will be released today. The team was in Tampa in the middle of June and toward the end of September. As you testified, this botched injection supposedly occurred at the end of July or the beginning of August. Can you reconcile this at this point as you look back on the schedule?
Sir, the botched injection is just something that I felt bad about that I might have done. I'm not exactly sure it was a botched injection. That's what I had told the people. But my recollection is...
Your deposition said this happened in the Tampa clubhouse, and I'm just saying the only times they were in Tampa were in the middle of June and the end of September. And as you testified before us, it was at the end of July or the beginning of August. And I'm just saying, could your memory be faulty on this?
Very much so.
Another problem is that head trainer Tommy Craig recalls nothing about any abscess in our conversations with him. Isn't it unusual that Tommy Craig would fail to recollect an injury like this to the star pitcher at the time?
Tommy Craig was a trainer for a very long time, and we're talking about 10 years ago. So I'm sure...
Which you seem to have a very vivid memory of, and no one else seems to.
That's why I told in my deposition I felt bad because I had assumed it was my fault.
If Craig treated an injury to Clemens' buttocks, wouldn't that be something he would recall? This was the star
You'd have
player.
to ask Tommy Craig.
Now, he wasn't the only member of the medical team that failed to recall the injury to Mr. Clemens' buttocks. Assistant trainer Scott Shannon, when asked, didn't remember it. Team doctor Ron Taylor didn't remember it. Team orthopedist Alan Gross, who ordered the MRI, didn't remember. In fact, when in his testimony, he came to a much different conclusion than these after-the-fact people who just looked at the MRI. If Roger Clemens, the most famous pitcher in baseball and really the franchise for the team at that point, at least on their pitching side, had developed an injury known to be the type of injury associated with steroids, wouldn't you expect someone to recollect it along the way?
Well,
except for you? You're the only one who seems to recollect it?
None of those people were injecting Roger Clemens with illegal steroids in his butt.
No, and whether you did or not, I think remains an open question. But the question I'm asking is, we're talking here about an injury to him that was a result of that. And they did see an injury and they ordered an MRI as a result of that. But none of the alarms went off. Now, the medical records show that Clemens had some type of injury to his buttocks at the end of July. There's no question about that. But according to the MRI, it was not an abscess. It was simply described as a palpable mass. In layman's terms, this could have simply been a bruise. Are you certain that Tommy Craig told you that Clemens had an abscess?
Yes, I'm certain.
Okay. Both head trainer Tommy Craig and team doctor Ron Taylor told us the MRI was ordered because they thought the bruise or buttocks injury may have been caused by a muscle tear. The MRI was not ordered to look for an abscess. The MRI was ordered because the team's star pitcher was injured. Now that you know Tommy Craig, Scott Shannon, Ron Taylor, Dr. Gross all say no abscess and no memory of this injury, you still stand by your allegation that he had an abscess?
It's not my allegation. He was getting treated for an abscess diagnosed by the head trainer, and he was getting treated with ultrasound, which it was right over the area, the ultrasound was right over the area where I injected Roger Clemens with Winstrol.
Okay. Now, Dr. Taylor says he gave 2 B12 shots in his life, and one was to Roger Clemens in July of 1998, which was the time of the injury and was not in Tampa. The medical records also say Clemens started complaining of soreness in his buttocks after receiving this injection. How can you be so sure this buttocks injury was not the result of the B12 shot, since that is the only shot that could have taken place at that point? The Tampa, where you alleged originally this took place, were going to be in June and September. How do you reconcile that?
I'm not sure I follow your question.
Well, the question is simple, that the only time they were in Tampa where you testified this took place was in June and September. This injury took place in July, the MRI, July-August timeframe. And we know that he received a shot for B12 during that time. So if there's any kind of shot or abscess, it would have had to be the B12 shot. It couldn't have been the steroid shot you're talking about because they weren't in Tampa at the time.
I know, but you misunderstood the deposition then, because what happened was I assumed, not knowing when the Tampa trip was, I just said because that was a hurried instance where we were in the closet, and that's where the injection took place. But I was unaware of the dates, and my recollection was...
Yes, you were unaware of the dates, which is why we have an inconsistency here.
Right, I wasn't aware of the dates.
That's right, you weren't. And now that you are, it makes your statement inconsistent, because this took place in the July-August time frame where they weren't in Tampa. Let me ask you this, Mr. McNamee. Why did you inject professional athletes with substances you knew to be forbidden or illegal as a former police officer?
Well, it was something I shouldn't have done, and I'm ashamed for it, and that's why I'm here today.
Why did you keep doing it?
I believe I haven't since 2002.
But why did you keep doing it for as many years?
I just accepted it as the norm, and it was part of the culture of baseball.
How prevalent was it?
Excuse me? Excuse me?
How prevalent was this in clubhouses across baseball at the time?
I think within the players it was pretty prevalent, and I'm not sure about other strength coaches and their involvement.
Okay. Yeah, Mr. Shays, I'll yield to you.
Just listening to your testimony, you said you believe you haven't injected anyone with any illegal drugs since 2002. What does the word believe mean? Did you or didn't you?
I wasn't really about ball players. I haven't, but I instructed Debbie Clemens in 2003.
Thank you. Let me ask a question before our time runs out. Did you ever tell Andy Pettit you were contemplating suing Hendrick Sports Management?
I might have.
Did you ever contemplate litigation against the L.A. Times following the stories relating to Jason Grimsley's affidavit?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Gentleman's time has expired. Just for the record, as I understand it, there was an injury on Mr. Clemens' buttocks. This was in the team records, and in the records it said that the injury was related to an injection. Do any of you disagree with those three statements?
No.
Okay.
No.
Mr. Chairman, let me just add, and there was an injection of a B12
shot, from what I understand in my medical reports.
That's one contention. The other contention, it was an injection of something else. But those 3 points that I made, for the record, are accurate. Mr. Kanjorski is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In an attempt not to have Mr. Sheeler appear to be a potted plant, I'm going to talk with you, Mr. I gather you were instrumental in preparing the Mitchell report. Is that correct?
I did assist Senator Mitchell. Yes,
Excuse me?
No.
I did assist Senator Mitchell. Yes, Congressman.
Okay. If you pull that a little closer to you, when you get to be my age, you lose about 20% of your hearing capacity. And I just don't want to embarrass the other younger citizens in the audience, okay? Let me preface my remarks with 1 or 2 comments. I have the highest regard for Senator Mitchell. As a matter of fact, at one time he was my proposed candidate for president. So, and I've known him for more than a quarter of a century. So any of the remarks that I make to you or questions I ask of you are not intended to impugn his credibility or his reliability. But having been involved in Washington in a few years and noting that the Mitchell report was quite extensive, in excess of 400 pages, is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, I know George Mitchell is a very dedicated person, but I don't suspect that George Mitchell wrote every one of those 400 pages in his own handwriting or even by his own dictation. Is that reasonable to assume?
He did not do the first draft of every word. But I will tell you that he reviewed every sentence, every comma, every semicolon on multiple occasions.
So would you say that he substantially stands by every fact set forth in that report?
Everything that we said in the report was, at the time we wrote the report, we had a good faith belief for it. And
We had a what?
We had a good faith belief for it, and we believed it to be true.
Okay, have you changed that opinion now?
No.
You believe every fact set forth in the report is true as set forth?
Sitting here at this moment, I cannot think of a single fact that we would recant. No.
So the supposed meeting that occurred at Canseco's house, you've reviewed that, and he is told a lie, and the people that reported the ball game, they've told a lie? Is that correct?
Well,
Or did that meeting not occur? Did it or didn't it occur? That's the question.
I would say at this point, we're not at a, it's not our role to judge what the subsequent facts are if they come to play.
Whoa. You mean to tell me if you're going to say I committed perjury or lied about some substantial fact, and in doing that, you placed me at a particular location, and then it turns out that you couldn't possibly have been there and you weren't there, that's not material to your report?
Well, let me try and put the Canseco lunch into perspective then for you. Obviously, Mr. McNamee told Senator Mitchell that Mr. Clemens had been at Mr. Canseco's house for a luncheon. And this, I would add, is an instance which shows it's one of the reasons why we would have liked to have talked to the current players, because we could have gotten additional facts.
Right. We would have liked to have talked to God to find out, but you didn't.
We would have liked to talk to the current
relied on one
players.
witness, and he put Mr. Clement at a location that supposedly other impartial parties have provided affidavits that he wasn't there and couldn't have been there. Now my question to you is the writer of that report, and I'll assume you're the writer of that report. Which of those facts is this committee and the public of the United States to accept? Did this meeting occur where the conversation of steroids occurred, or didn't it?
Well, let me take issue with a premise of your question, because it's important to understand that at that meeting, we do not write that any conversations about steroids took place at the Jose Canseco luncheon.
Okay.
If I could complete my statement.
I only have 5 minutes, so I don't want you to filibuster. We're used to the Senate doing that, but we don't do that in the House. So I want you to respond as quickly as you can so we can move through these facts.
I'll do my best.
Okay. Now, now are you contending that the fact that that meeting occurred and whether or not Mr. Clement was there is not important and is meaningless and shouldn't have been in the record? Or was it placed there for some purpose to show that there could have been a semi-conspiracy occurring and discussions being had, and this was just another element of that evidence? What is it?
This was placed in the report in large part because of the fact that we also interviewed Jose Canseco. And Mr. Canseco advised us that he had had repeated conversations.
Didn't he advise you that that meeting did not occur under oath?
Well, he was not under oath when we spoke to him. We did not have the ability to place people under oath.
Okay. So now are you concluding that did he tell you that meeting did not occur?
He did not answer that question because we did not ask it. At the time we interviewed Mr. Canseco, that was July 11th, 2006 in Fullerton, California. At that time, we did not know of this issue of the Canseco lunch.
Mr.
So we didn't
Kondrasky,
ask him.
your time has expired.
Could I just close with the last question, Mr. Chairman?
Please, go ahead. No one objects.
Now, in this hearing, did that meeting occur or didn't that meeting occur?
I think you can draw your own judgments. I have heard since the report came out evidence suggesting that Mr. Clemens was at the lunch, evidence suggesting Mr. Clemens was not at the lunch. The one point I would like to make about that lunch is that Senator Mitchell did not state in the report that there was either performance-enhancing substance use discussed, nor were any performance-enhancing substances exchanged during the course of that luncheon.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Micah for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McNamee, you've come up with so-called physical evidence of possible steroid use that I believe you turned over to investigators.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And is that, as I understand it, there's gauze?
I can't hear you very well.
As I understand it, there's gauze and there's a syringe.
Yes, sir.
Is that the extent of it? The physical evidence?
There is empty, broken ampoules that were used with those syringes. There is some unused ampoules, about 7 or 8 of them, I believe. There's also about 30 or so 2-inch needle heads, along with a bottle of white pills, along with the evidence.
Okay. The gauze that I saw looked like it had some blood stains on it. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And that blood would, if it was DNA tested, you think it would be Mr. Clemens?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And you could have had gauze with his blood stains on it because you had done several injection procedures on him and also treated him. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Mr. Clemens claims that he was treated with vitamin B12, I guess it was, and did you do some of those injections?
I can't hear you, sir.
I said Mr. Clemens has said that you treated him with injections of vitamin B12. Is that correct?
Negative.
You never did any B12?
No, sir.
Okay. What color is this? Well, then you claim you gave him a steroid or a compound. What was it that you claim that you gave him the injections of?
It was throughout the course of the years. It was Winstrol, also known as Stanzanol.
Mm-hmm.
There was testosterones, steroids, and HGH, human growth hormone.
What colors are the testosterone, the various liquids that?
The Winstrol, the Stanzanol from '98 was like a powdery white or a milky white liquid, water base somewhat. The testosterones were more of an oily, clear to a little bit darker, almost like a honey color. And the HGH, once it was mixed with the diluted water, it would become clear.
So basically clear to honey tone.
And milky white.
Mr. Clemens, you claim that you did admit that you were injected with vitamin B12 and also you admitted to lidocaine. Okay. What color is the vitamin B12 shot? You told me you had quite a few shots.
Brian McNamee gave me shots on 4 to 6 occasions of B12. It's red or pink in color. Lidocaine, I do not know the color of lidocaine.
Mm-hmm.
He gave me 1 shot of lidocaine in my lower back, and that happened in Toronto. I have no idea.
No, he could have gauze with your blood sample on it. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Okay. But you have said that the only 2 injected substances you had that you, and was it Mr. McNamee that injected those 2 substances?
That's correct.
Okay. And you also said that you knew very distinctively the color of the B12 because you'd had that injection, and that's a fairly distinctive color.
That is correct. It was red or pinkish in color. And
what color was what he injected you when you thought it was B12?
I'm sorry?
What color was it when he injected you when you thought it was B12?
It was red and pink. B12 was red and pink that he gave me. I don't remember the color of the lidocaine. It was 1 shot. He told me it would give me some freeness in my back.
So we may never know because he may in fact, and you say he would have gauze with possibly your blood DNA sample on it. That would be correct?
He sure could have.
Okay. But we don't know what he injected, but he just testified that the substance was a different color than in fact you recognized. And in fact, you told me on a prior occasion the color of the substance you were injected with. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
I said, you told me the color of the substance you were injected with. That's why I asked him that.
That's correct.
Question.
That's correct.
First, so you
Gentleman's
don't
time
think
has
you don't think
expired.
he's telling the truth then?
Brian McNamee's never given me growth hormone or steroids.
Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Malone, do you want to take your 5 minutes now?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Mr. Clemens, as a New Yorker, we are very proud of your professional achievements. Thank you for your many efforts to help children through your foundation. And you are an important role model to many young people. And I am concerned about these allegations against you and your conflicting response to many of them. First of all, the Mitchell report was released in December of 2007. And after it was issued, you began speaking out against these allegations. One question that I have is, why did you refuse to talk to Senator Mitchell when he reached out to you before the report was released? And specifically on page 175 of his report, it says, and I quote, "In order to provide Clemens with information about these allegations and to give him an opportunity to respond, I asked him to meet with me, and he declined," end quote. As part of your public statements, you went on 60 Minutes, and during an interview with Mike Wallace, he asked you, why didn't you speak to George Mitchell's investigators? And in response, you stated, and I quote, "I listened to my counsel. I was advised not to. A lot of the players did not go down and talk to him as well." And do you remember saying that to Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes?
Yes.
Mr. Clemens, in your deposition with our committee, you gave a very different explanation. You did not tell us your lawyers told you not to speak to Senator Mitchell. You repeatedly told us you had no idea Senator Mitchell wanted to talk to you. And let me give you some examples from the transcript. First, on page 112 of your deposition, you were asked, were you aware that Senator Mitchell was seeking to interview you? And your answer was, I was not. Then later on page 112, Senator Mitchell sent a letter to the Players Union in July of 2007 requesting an interview with you, and you were not, you testified that you were not aware of this request. You said, I was not aware of it. Then on page 117, when Mr. Hendricks, your agent, heard about the invitation, did he communicate with you that you were invited to talk to Senator Mitchell? And your agent, you answered that he did not even communicate this request to you. Then on page 115 in the July time framework, your agent Hendricks never said to you, by the way, Senator Mitchell wants to talk to you. And your answer was, that is correct. Then on page 116 in October, Senator Mitchell informed the Players Union that any player who agreed to an interview would be provided with the evidence that Senator Mitchell had. Did you know of this in 2007? And your answer was, I did not. And then you made this definitive statement, and I quote, I had no idea that Senator Mitchell wanted to talk to me. If it was about baseball and steroids in general, I would have wanted to see him. And obviously, if I knew what Brian McNamee was saying about me in this report, I would have been there, end quote. So, Mr. Clemens, there were 6 times that you told our committee under oath that you had no idea that Mitchell wanted to talk to you. Yet you said on national television that you refused to talk to Senator Mitchell on the advice of your attorneys. So I have 2 questions about this. First, why did you give one explanation on 60 Minutes for why you failed to talk to Senator Mitchell, and a different explanation in the depositions before this committee?
Congresswoman, the fact of the matter was I was never told by my baseball agent/attorney that we are asked to come down and see Senator Mitchell. Like you said in that statement, if I knew the lies that Brian McNamee were telling about me, I would have been down there to see Senator Mitchell in a heartbeat, in a New York minute, if you will. I was never told about that. The Players Association, from my understanding, reached out to a lot of the players. I don't believe any player went down other than, from what I understand, Jason Giambi. And it was relayed to Mr. Hendricks, who you stated his name in that, my earlier testimony. It was never brought to me. From talking to Randy Hendricks and I believe the Players Association, in my situation, I had to answer allegations back in 2006 about an LA Times report.
But would you say then that your agents did you a terrible disservice by not bringing this information to you, that you had an opportunity to talk before the report came out?
I would say so. And
can I ask, what actions did you take after you learned that your agents kept from you Senator Mitchell's inquiry? I would say that if the Ethics Committee in the House sent me a letter about possible illegal action and my staff kept this information from me, I would have fired my staff. And so my question to you, have you fired these agents that did not inform you about this? What action have you taken with this really breach of trust?
No, I haven't. And with all respect, Senator Mitchell, from what I understand, again, was asked by members of the Players Association, what do you have to talk about with these players? And would you please tell us what it is? And they said, we're not going to respond to that. You'll have to come down and see us.
My time has expired.
Thank the gentlelady. Mr. Souder for 5 minutes.
Thank you. This has been very frustrating. I'm sure it's been very frustrating to those who are watching, too. When you testify in front of this committee, it's better not to talk about the past than to lie about the past. Somebody's not telling the truth today. Now, I'm disappointed that the other witnesses are not here. And I understand from the chairman that we plan to release those depositions. And I hope the public understands that what we're having today is a very short form. I went through most of these depositions last night, hundreds of pages. And when this is released, you're going to get somewhat of a more comprehensive view. What's interesting today is to see the interaction, but I would argue that those depositions are fairly devastating. Mr. McNamee, there was something that caught my attention that I would like to raise. It was a side comment fairly far into your testimony. You were discussing related issues, and you alleged that David Cohn, a player rep for, I believe then, the Toronto Blue Jays, said, quote, the owners want the union, the owners went to the union and said, we don't want to test, but you've got to give us some valid excuse to go to the media. Do you have any more knowledge of that, and is that an accurate characterization of what you said? Because that is an incredible allegation here, because the union has been being blamed for not testing, and that there hasn't been an investigation of the owners thus far. And what you're saying is a player rep went to who and said that? Did you hear the second hand, third hand?
The player rep came to me, and that's what was told to me.
And why
those statements.
And why did he come to you?
Because of my background, and he wanted to know. He was talking to me on the back of the plane about the current state, which reverts back to I believe it was 2000, and I think it was just a conversation, and he thought maybe I had some knowledge that might have led to believe that steroid use didn't enhance hand-eye coordination, which is what baseball is mainly depicted as far as ability.
Mr. Chairman, I know you don't want to have another hearing. I'm not advocating another hearing, but the Mitchell report was not targeted towards the ownership, and it's one thing we haven't investigated. This is a second to third hand type of revelation, but I think that the staff needs to look at this, because this comes to the core question of the legislation that you, I, Congressman Cummings, Congressman Davis, and Senator McCain introduced about whether we can trust baseball to, in fact, do testing on themselves. And if it's true that the owners wanted to, in effect, cover up and not have testing, This is a very serious allegation.
Well, I thank the gentleman for his comments.
That,
We'll discuss it.
also, Mr. McNamee, when he held the press conference and played the tape live to the national media, that appears to really have ticked you off.
Yes, sir.
You made a reference in your deposition that that's when you produced the physical evidence.
Yes.
Do you believe that physical evidence, friend Mr. Micah was questioning, yes, there'll be blood. Mr. Clemens said that the blood could be from a number of other things. Do you believe that physical evidence will tie it directly to an illegal drug?
Yes, I do.
Do you believe it can be debated whether or not, in other words, will it be on the needle or something that clearly takes the DNA to that? Have you ever handled physical evidence when you were a policeman?
Physical evidence?
Yes, like this. How to
No,
track it, how to protect it, what it's likely to show. So are you speculating at this point, or do you know in fact that the DNA will be traced to HGH or steroids?
I'm speculating.
Okay. Because the DNA, if it's clear, will not disremember. In other words, it will help settle the debate. But if there's a dispute whether it was B12 or that even could be confusing. But I think it's important for the record because I chaired the Narcotics Committee for a long time, and I can't tell you how much these depositions look like any kind of narcotics debate we have. It looks like cocaine. It looks like methamphetamine. And when you talked in your testimony about lying in the early stages, we often see witnesses who are caught, who go to the federal government and initially give up just enough so they think they're not going to go to jail, but they don't really turn over their major clients. And then something ticks them off, and they go a step further. And that could be another explanation, but it may be, if it doesn't show the tracking, that it's going to be very difficult to resolve. But the other reason, Mr. Chairman, I think it's very important that you've committed to release the depositions is that, in fact, Mr. McNamee has been verified by Mr. Knobloch is accurate. He's been verified by Mr. Pettit is accurate. Radomski, who was under federal investigation, supports a lot of that, although we don't have a deposition on him. And one last thing, it would have been great to have Mr. Knobloch here today because it was a sad testimony that he had about his life experiences and about how he wanted to come clean for his family. I urge people to read that. And if I could make one last thing, I am incredibly disappointed with the players and the pressure that they put on it comes through all these depositions about not to talk. If families in America don't talk about the drug abuse in their neighborhoods, and the locker room would be your neighborhoods, if you don't talk about that drug abuse, there was a family in Baltimore that Congressman Cummings and I did a bill on, the Dawson family, that their house was firebombed, that all of them were killed, all their children, because they talked. And yet baseball players somehow, and management and trainers, think they're above it, that there's some kind of a snitch, that there's some kind of a thing wrong if you talk about other players. The fact is we can't get control of drug abuse unless you turn over other people and cooperate. And this wall of silence coming out of baseball has been disgusting. And it took the federal government, the Balco case, to get anything out of this. Then it took the hearings to get the Mitchell report. And now we've got all kinds of questions coming off that and whether management was in fact involved. When people say that there should not be an independent test, I don't see how, given this track record, they think there can be anything but independent testing. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Souder. Mr. Clay?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Clemens, at our previous hearing in 2005, one witness clearly misled this committee. Another temporarily lost his ability to speak and understand the English language, while a third witness decided that he didn't want to talk about the past. You have 4 sons, and you understand how young athletes admire players of your caliber. Can I look at my 2 children with a straight face and tell them that you, Roger Clemens, have always played the game with honesty and integrity?
Yes, sir.
And there would be no doubt that that's true.
Without a question. I took no shortcuts. I can tell you about my upbringing. There were, I've heard the thing about pampered athletes and million-dollar ball players. I've heard that from my own counsel, and I take a little offense to that for the fact that my father passed away when I was 9 years old. My mother, I was raised by great, strong women, my mother and my grandmother. They gave me my will, my determination. I've had my work ethic, which again is come in question here by a man at this table, that he made me. He made me who I was. I didn't meet him until 1998. In 1997, I won the Triple Crown in pitching. I already had over 200 wins. But he coaxed me on a statement. He says he coaxed me to 4 Cy Youngs, and if you do the math, I would have 9 Cy Youngs according to his math, and I don't.
You have 7.
I have 7, thank you. My career, Mr. Congressman, didn't happen by accident. I worked extremely hard. I've had a great work ethic since I was in high school. I didn't have a car in high school. I ran home, which my condominium or townhome was about 2 miles from my house. My sister reminded me that when you went to the University of Texas, the only way I was going to further my education, my mother didn't have the means. She worked 3 jobs. She didn't have the means to send me to college. So it came through the game of baseball, which we love. So it's very hurtful to me and my family and to the children that look up to us. The congressman earlier, I guess he stepped out. My innocent sister-in-law was murdered, brutally murdered, because of drugs. It hurt our family. My mother pulled my other athletic brother, my middle brother, if you will, my next older brother, I have 2 brothers and 3 sisters, out of college because of an incident that happened on campus involving marijuana. Pulled him out of campus, and I tip my hat to my brother. He went on to finish school and get his degree. These are the values that we have, that I have, and that I'll continue to have. Somebody's tried to break my spirit in this room. They're not going to break my spirit. I'm going to continue to go out and do the things that I love to do and try and be honest and genuine to every person I can be. It's the way I was brought up. It's what I know. But you can tell your boys that I did it the right way, and I worked my butt off to do it.
Thank you for that response. You have a very compelling and telling story about your life and career. A colleague of mine, Mr. Capuano of Massachusetts, wants to know what uniform you will wear to the Hall of Fame.
Can I ask you may I state that I didn't hear that question?
That's fine. That's fine. Let me ask Mr. McNamee. Sir, when you first spoke to the government about this matter, did you deny that Roger Clemens ever used steroids or HGH?
No, sir.
You never denied it to federal authorities?
No, sir.
Okay. I recognize how intense the pressure can be when testifying for federal prosecutors. Did their intimidation tactics influence you to give conflicting testimony?
No, sir.
You sure about that?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Were you granted 5 years probation in exchange for your testimony?
No, sir.
You don't have a deal sitting on the table with federal prosecutors?
No, sir.
To come before this committee and to say what you've said. You don't have a deal at all?
No deal, sir.
Were you simply telling the prosecutors what they wanted to hear in order to secure a deal for yourself?
No, sir.
You've answered truthfully to all my questions.
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for
Thank you,
this
Mr. Clay.
time.
Your time has expired. The chair is going to take his time for questioning. Mr. Clemens, I'm puzzled about something that happened last week, and I'd like you to help me understand why you did what you did.
Okay.
You have a tough job today. You said you find it very hard to have to prove a negative, but your attorneys have provided documentation to rebut the passage in the Mitchell report about a party at Jose Canseco's house. I don't view this passage as anything central to the issue before us, but it's important that we know if it's true. And your attorneys and you have been very forceful in telling us that the report is wrong. You were not at Jose Canseco's house between June 8th and June 10th, 1998, when the Toronto Blue Jays were playing in Miami. During your deposition, you were asked, could you have been at this house during this time period, June 8th to June 10, 1998? And you answered no. Is that a correct statement?
On the date, sir?
Did you answer no to the question whether you were at Jose Canseco's party?
If you repeat your question, then I can, please.
Well, during your deposition, you were asked, could you have been at his house during this time period, which was June 8th to 10th, 1998? And you answered no. You've given us supporting materials. You provided an affidavit from Jose Canseco that said that you were not at his house during the team party on June 9th. You provided a golf receipt from 8:58 a.m. on June 9th, which showed that at least that morning you were purchasing merchandise at the golf course next to Canseco's house. And you provided excerpts from a baseball broadcast that reported that you were not at the team party. And these came up when several other members asked you about it. It's all very helpful. When the committee took Mr. McNamee's deposition, he had a completely different recollection, as he has today. He had a clear recollection that Mr. Clemens was at Mr. Canseco's home. So our committee staff investigated this issue, and we received conflicting evidence. I'm not surprised by conflicting recollections of a party around 10 years ago. That was really of no special importance. But Jose Canseco thinks Roger Clemens and Mr. Canseco's ex-wife weren't at the party. Mr. Canseco's ex-wife, Jessica Fisher, believes that she was there, and so was Debbie Clemens. Mr. McNamee told us that one key witness who would know whether you were at Canseco's house for that party was your former nanny. And the committee staff asked your attorneys for her name last Friday so we could contact her. We made additional requests for her name and contact information over the weekend. Around 5 p.m. on Sunday afternoon, committee staff made another request and asked your attorneys to refrain from contacting the nanny before the committee staff could speak with her. It wasn't until Monday afternoon that your attorneys provided the nanny's name and phone number to the committee. And it wasn't until yesterday that the committee staff actually spoke with the nanny. Are you aware of all this? Timeline about the nanny?
I'm not sure of all the time frame. I know that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what the nanny said to us when we finally contacted her yesterday was important in several respects. First, she said that she was at Mr. Canseco's home during the relevant time period. In fact, she said that she and Mrs. Clemens and the children stay overnight at the Cansecos. Secondly, she told us she did not remember any team party as described in the Mitchell report. And third, she said that she did remember that you were at that home during the relevant time period, although she didn't know how long you stayed or whether you spent the night with your family. The third point directly contradicted your deposition testimony, where you said you were not at Mr. Canseco's home at any point June 8th to June 10th, 1998. But it's entirely understandable to me. It was 10 years ago. Here's what puzzles me about your actions. We have a transcript of the interview with the nanny, whose name I'm not going to release to protect her privacy. But in this transcript, she says that on Sunday, this last Sunday, you called her and asked her to come to your Houston home. She had not seen you in person since 2001. But after you called, she went to your home on Sunday afternoon. I'd like to read a portion of the transcript of the committee interview. Question, when you said you didn't remember a party, what did he say? Answer, he says, you know, the reason you don't remember that party is because I wasn't there. He said, because I know that he was playing with Jose. Question, so did he ask you, do you remember a party, and then you said you did not remember a party? Answer, that's right. She also told the committee staff that you told her that she should tell the committee the truth. And after your meeting, an investigator working for you called her and asked her a series of additional questions. Your meeting took place 2 days after the committee staff made a simple request for your former nanny's name. And then it took 24 hours after your meeting for your attorneys to provide her name to the Republican and Democratic staffs. And that's why I'm puzzled about this. What was it your idea? What was it Was it your idea to meet with her before forwarding her name to us, or did someone suggest that to you?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that just like through this whole hearings, I was doing y'all a favor by finding a nanny that was supposedly came in question.
Well, you might have been trying to do us a favor, but who told you you should invite her to your house that you haven't seen her in all those years?
Chairman, this is unfair. What his lawyers tell him is unfair for you to ask, and I will tell you.
Okay, well, I accept that. I accept that. I accept that. Gentlemen, please be seated. Was it your idea? That's the appropriate. Was it your idea?
It was my idea to investigate what witnesses know.
Okay.
Just like any other lawyer in the free world does.
Did you think, Mr. Clemens, it was a good idea to invite her to your home on Sunday after not seeing her for 7 years?
I'm sorry?
Did you think it was a good idea to invite her to your home after you hadn't seen her for 7 years?
I was told on Friday night to see if we could locate the nanny. We'll leave. Obviously, that's very nice. I don't think that she needs any publicity, but I was told on Friday night that you guys may want to talk to her, and so.
And you felt you should talk to her first. Yeah. Well, I don't know if there's anything improper in this.
Mr. Chairman, I ain't talked to her in years, and I did everything I could to locate her. If you guys had any questions for her, and I did tell her to answer truthfully. I'm not sure.
Well, I don't know if there's anything improper in this, but I do know it sure raises an appearance of impropriety. The impression it leaves is terrible. The right way to have handled this would have been to give the committee information immediately, to not have your people interview the nanny before we did, and certainly for you not to personally talk to her about the interview as you did. One option for you was to have given the committee the nanny's contact information and had no contact with her. Another option could have been to give her a heads up that the committee would be calling her. But you chose, I think, the worst approach. That's my opinion. You invited her to your home, had a specific conversation about whether you were at Mr. Canseco's house, and you did this before you gave the committee her contact information.
Mr. Chairman,
is there anything else you want to add?
In all due respect, this is nothing but innuendo. Your committee asked on Friday evening for this information. We have done everything to give you that information in a fast and in a thorough manner. The innuendo is terrible, and I spoke to your own staff member who's speaking with you now. And your statement and I have the highest respect for the chairman, is calculated to do nothing but to have innuendo against this man. We have cooperated
well, I
with
understand
the fully, as your own
gentlemen,
staff is
as I indicated, the rules do not allow the lawyers to speak, but I did not cut you off.
Thank you.
This action means there's always going to be a question whether you try to influence her testimony. And I gather your lawyer thinks that's
Mr. Chairman, I was doing y'all a favor, and as far as I was concerned, I haven't seen this lady in a long time. She's a sweet lady, and I wanted her to get her to you as quick as possible if you had any questions for her. Again, I'm hurt by those statements that I would get in the way of finding anything that you guys were looking for. I'm hurt by that statement.
We asked her to come be brought to the house.
The gentleman is not going to be recognized. My time is up. Ms. Norton is here, and I want to recognize her for 5 minutes to ask questions she might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank both Mr. McNamee and Mr. Clemens for having the guts to show up here without having been subpoenaed. Mr. Clemens, much of what we're about here turns on concrete evidence, but much of it on credibility. And my questions really go to your long-standing relationship with Mr. McNamee. We almost 10 years of relationship from '98 with the Blue Jays until 2007, and a whole string of evidence about the closeness of that relationship. You're training with him in Kentucky. Got you Bruce Springsteen. You got him Bruce Springsteen tickets. I'd call that love. You lent him fishing gear, and to quote your statement, I trusted him, put my faith in him, and brought him around my family and my children. I treated him just like I've done others I've met in my life, like family. That's pretty close. isn't it fair to say you were on quite good terms with Mr. McNamee until you found out what he told Senator Mitchell?
Congresswoman, I did not get him Bruce Springsteen tickets.
Well, let us correct the record.
And yes, I trusted Brian McNamee like I trusted every other trainer or...
well, I quoted you on how you trusted him.
Yes, I totally understand.
But I asked you, therefore, don't your own statements show that you were on good terms with him until you found out what he told Senator Mitchell?
I would say I was on good terms with him. We had obviously what I've learned now.
Yeah, but you see, I'm not talking
sorry.
about now. Now is after the Mitchell report. Of course, you and your legal team are raising very serious questions about incidents in Mr. McNamee's past. Some of them were public, some of them were not. But I think they would cause reasonable people to lose trust and confidence in Mr. McNamee. For example, that he gave you without your knowledge what you later came to believe while he's still your trainer, and amphetamine. Indeed, you described a confrontation, your word, that you had with him about this particular incident. You told us that he falsely claimed that your own workout was his, and how you bit your lip and your tongue as you watched him do this. You even say that a company associated with the McNamee used your image in an advertisement without your consent. And finally, of course, perhaps most personally, that Mr. McNamee injected your wife with HGH in your master bedroom without your knowledge. And you described here in prior testimony today some of the repercussions she had from that injection. Now, you were well aware of all of these concerns before the Mitchell report was released. So I've got to ask you, sir, if Mr. McNamee did all of these things, and they appear not to be in doubt, including injecting your wife with HGH without your knowledge, why did you continue to employ him?
Congresswoman, the incident that he told me from the St. Pete situation that he got let go from the Yankees, I was told a different story. I was told that he saved a woman's life. That, again, he took a hit for 5 other guys on that situation. I believe I worked.
What about what he did to you, Mr. Clemens? What about the incidents I have said and how
That's right.
seriously they affected you? Why did you continue to employ him given what he had done to you?
That's correct. And what I was, the point I was getting to, I believe there was a work stoppage for 2 or 3 months. I believe Mr. Pettit was playing again. We continued to play. I was still trying to make up my mind again. I'm not great at retirement. I've tried to retire 3 times. It's not working. But there was a work stoppage there. There was a work stoppage with him until after the incident with my wife, which he, again, earlier he said that he directed.
Excuse me, work stoppage?
Or I didn't hire him as a trainer. I actually had a different trainer for 2 months that I worked with.
And the reason for that was?
I was going in a different direction. So.
And then you had him as your trainer again.
I'm sorry?
And then you had him as your trainer again.
I did, and
my question, Mr. Clemens, is why did you keep the man? It's very simple. Why did you keep the man? He did some pretty horrendous things, which are on the record, which you yourself said. Why did you keep him? And why only after the Mitchell report did your relationship with him end?
Well, Brian McNamee, again, we had a heated discussion. He apologized to me on the situation with my wife.
How about the other things?
I'm a forgiving person. I don't
like I said, I don't. When he told me that he was a doctor, and he had a PhD, I had no reason to look behind that. I mean, he was employed by Major League Baseball. He ran an ad, and basically I let him have it about that, told him about it, that you cannot do that kind of stuff. I think that's when he said that he was going to sue my baseball attorney. And quite often it happens in my life. The other day I had a gentleman come and talk to me about that they were excited that they just bought a lot down from my house in the area that they were playing golf in. And I let them know that I hate to burst their bubble, but I don't have a lot at that house. So it happens quite often. Again, I learned, Ms. Congresswoman, I learned, like I said, about that I had no reason to believe that he wasn't a doctor, and obviously the lies that I know now that he's told me.
And all the stuff that he did to you. Mr. Clemens, all I can say is, I'm sure you're going to heaven. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Norton. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and then we'll reconvene and continue the questioning.
Hey, won't you get
The committee will please come to order. Before we begin our hearing, the chair wants to make some personal statements and statements on behalf of all of our colleagues about the seat that is next to me that is vacant. That seat was occupied by Representative Tom Lantos, who passed away this week. Those of us who have worked with Tom Lantos over the years know about his deep commitment and compassion, his integrity, and his leadership, not only on behalf of his constituents, but the people of this country and around the world. He was a champion for human rights. He was a member of this committee, but he was also chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And I think it's appropriate that, as a longtime member of this committee and a very esteemed member of Congress, that we recognize him and have a moment of silence. But before I call for that moment of silence, I'd like to recognize Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Having survived unalterable inhumanity, Tom Lantos spent the rest of his life giving voice to the ideals of human rights and freedom. His keen intellect, indomitable spirit, and wry insights left an indelible mark on all that he touched. We are grateful to have known him. He will be missed, but not forgotten. And we take solace in the Hebrew lesson. There are stars whose light only reaches the earth long after they have fallen apart. There are people whose remembrance gives light in this world long after they have passed away. Their light shines in our darkest nights on the road we must follow. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. And if you would all just please remember him in a moment of silence. This is our second hearing on Senator Mitchell's report on the illegal use of steroids and other performance-enhancing substances by players in Major League Baseball. This hearing is focused on the accuracy of an important section of that report, the section that is based on the information that strength and fitness coach Brian McNamee provided to Senator Mitchell. This committee has a special connection to the Mitchell report. In 2005, when Representative Tom Davis was our chairman, the two of us urged Commissioner Seelig to investigate baseball's history with performance-enhancing substances. The commissioner agreed with our suggestion and appointed Senator George Mitchell to lead that effort. Senator Mitchell's report is impressive and credible. He concluded that the use of performance-enhancing substance was pervasive for more than a decade, and that everyone in baseball, the players, the union, the owners, and the commissioner, were responsible for the scandal. Senator Mitchell released his report on December 13th. That same day, is in telling the truth that he has acted shamefully and has smeared Mr. McNamee. I don't think there's anything in between. After we had completed our depositions, my instinct was to cancel this hearing and issue a written report. We've learned a lot about Mr. McNamee's allegations and Mr. Clemens' account, and I thought a bipartisan report setting out the facts with Mr. Davis might be the most effective way to present the results of our investigation. But others had different views, and I was particularly influenced by the view of Mr. Clemens' attorneys, who thought it would be unfair if the committee issued a report without giving Mr. Clemens the opportunity to testify in public. So I decided to proceed with this hearing, which I expect will be the last hearing this committee will have on baseball's past or the Mitchell report. In today's hearing, Mr. McNamee's credibility will be bolstered by the testimony the committee received from Mr. Knobloch and Mr. Pettit in their depositions. Mr. McNamee named 3 players in the Mitchell report: Mr. Knobloch, Mr. Pettit, and Mr. Clemens. None of these players talked with Senator Mitchell, but now 2 of them have told us under oath that Mr. McNamee told the truth as it related to them. Senator Mitchell told us in our January 15th hearing that 2 other factors supported Mr. McNamee's credibility. First, he said that the only penalty Mr. McNamee faced in dealing with federal prosecutors was perjury, which meant that he faced legal jeopardy only if he lied. And second, Mr. McNamee was being paid by Mr. Clemens in 2007, as he had been paid for many years, and he had an economic interest against implicating the individual who supported his livelihood and was his most prominent client. On the other hand, the committee learned that Mr. McNamee has twice failed to tell the government investigators the full truth. There was an incident in Florida in 2001 that is not related to the matter before us, but relates to Mr. McNamee's credibility. We are not going to make that incident part of today's hearing, but Mr. Davis and I have prepared a joint statement that will be part of today's record. We are stipulating for the record that Mr. McNamee lied to police officers when they investigated the matter. Mr. McNamee does not dispute that he lied, but told us he did it to protect others. Mr. McNamee was never charged in that case. Of more direct relevance To this matter, it's clear from our deposition with Mr. McNamee that he didn't tell federal prosecutors everything he knew. In his deposition, Mr. McNamee acknowledged that he misled prosecutors about the number of injections he gave Mr. Knobloch and Mr. Clemens. Until last month, he also withheld from the prosecutors physical evidence that he says implicates Mr. Clemens. Mr. McNamee says he did not tell the full truth because he, and I quote him, "I was trying not to hurt the guy. I felt awful for being in the situation I put myself into. There was a feeling of betrayal. I shouldn't have done it, but I didn't want to hurt him as bad as I could," end quote. That's no excuse. It's a serious matter. This committee announced a hearing with Senator Mitchell, Commissioner Seelig, baseball player union leader Don Fear. We intended for that hearing to close the chapter on looking at baseball's past. On the same day the Mitchell report was released, however, Roger Clemens, through his attorney Rusty Hardin, publicly challenged the accuracy of the section of the report that presented evidence of his use of steroids and human growth hormone. Mr. Hardin later told the committee that the Mitchell report is a horrible, disgraceful report. Given the committee's past work and our interest in an accurate record of baseball's steroid era, we have investigated the evidence in Senator Mitchell's report that relates to Mr. McNamee and the players he identified. Tom Davis and I made this decision reluctantly. We have no interest in making baseball a central part of our committee's agenda. But if the Mitchell report is to be the last word on baseball's past, we believed we had a responsibility to investigate a serious claim of inaccuracy. The committee's inquiry and this hearing are focused on the accuracy of the Mitchell report as it relates to information provided by Brian McNamee. Mr. Davis and I both believe that this narrow focus is important. We have carefully limited our inquiry to the relevant facts regarding Mr. McNamee's interactions with 3 players he claims to have supplied with these substances. In the course of this investigation, we've been able to probe more deeply than Senator Mitchell could. Senator Mitchell could only ask for information and had no power to subpoena documents or to insist that individuals talk to him. As the Chief Investigative Committee in the House of Representatives, we have greater authority and have been able to consider evidence that was not available to Senator Mitchell. I will now summarize some of the information our investigation has uncovered. Based on the information that Brian McNamee provided Senator Mitchell, he reported that Chuck Knobloch used human growth hormone in 2001. According to the report, quote, beginning during spring training and continuing through the early portion of the season, McNamee injected Knobloch at least 7 to 9 times with human growth hormone. Mr. Knobloch voluntarily met with the committee on February 1 and told us that Mr. McNamee was accurate when he told Senator Mitchell that Mr. McNamee had injected him with human growth hormone. Mr. Knobloch also told us about additional injections of human growth hormone that were not reported by Senator Mitchell. Mr. Knobloch told us that he administered HGH injections to himself in 2002. There is no mention of these injections in Senator Mitchell's report or in any published account. In a moving part of his deposition, Mr. Knobloch said, "My son was here today, and I'm trying not to get emotional about this, but I am trying to teach him a lesson that you need to do things in life that you are going to be willing to talk about openly and to tell the truth." On behalf of the committee, I want to thank Mr. Knobloch for his cooperation and for his candor in accepting responsibility for his actions. Based on the information Mr. McNamee provided, Senator Mitchell also reported that Andy Pettit used human growth hormone. Mr. McNamee has known Mr. Pettit since 1999 and has worked as his personal fitness coach. According to the Mitchell report, Mr. McNamee recalled that he injected Pettit with human growth hormone on 2 to 4 occasions in 2002. Andy Pettit voluntarily met with the committee for a sworn deposition on February 4 and told the committee that the information that Mr. McNamee provided to Senator Mitchell was accurate. In addition, Mr. Pettit told the committee about a second time he used human growth hormone. This occurred in 2004 when Mr. Pettit injected himself twice with HGH when he was recovering from an injury. Mr. Pettit had never told anyone outside of his family about this incident, but he volunteered it during the deposition because he wanted to provide a complete record to the committee. Mr. Pettit also provided additional information of particular relevance to this hearing, which I'll describe later in my statement. On behalf of the committee, I want to commend Mr. Pettit for his cooperation. He found himself in an extremely uncomfortable position, but he did the right thing and told the truth. During his deposition, he was asked how he approached this difficult situation, and he said, quote, "I have to tell you the truth, and one day I have to give an account to God and not to nobody else about what I've done in my life, and that's why I've said and shared the stuff that I wouldn't like to share with you all," end quote. Mr. Pettit's consistent honesty makes him a role model on and off the field. And finally, based on the information that Brian McNamee provided, Senator Mitchell reported that Roger Clemens used human growth hormone and steroids. Brian McNamee told Senator Mitchell that on over 20 occasions he injected Roger Clemens with either human growth hormone or steroids. All of us from time to time can have memory lapses. If any of us were asked to recall a specific incident or event that occurred 10 years ago, we might get the substance right, but we'd be off on some details. I think most of us can relate to that. It's rare, however, to have the situation the committee faces today. Mr. Clemens and Mr. McNamee have both cooperated fully with us, and both have given us sworn statements. They both insist that they are telling the truth, but their accounts couldn't be more different. They don't disagree on a phone call or one meeting. They disagree on whether over a period of 4 years, Mr. McNamee repeatedly injected Mr. Clemens with steroids and human growth hormone. It's impossible to believe that this is a simple misunderstanding. Someone isn't telling the truth. If Mr. McNamee is lying, then he has acted inexcusably, and he has made Mr. Clemens an innocent victim. If Mr. Clemens that Mr. McNamee did not tell the investigators the full truth, we need to keep this in mind in evaluating his credibility today. Mr. Clemens has visited with many committee members personally in the last few days. One point he and his attorneys have made is that it would make no sense for him to testify under oath if he actually used steroids. In judging his credibility, the risk that he takes by testifying today needs to be taken into account. It's also relevant that Mr. Clemens is a credible and convincing person. I'm also aware of the tremendous amount of good that Mr. Clemens has done through the Roger Clemens Foundation, and I thank you for helping so many children. But it is also true that as we move forward in our investigation, we found conflicts and inconsistencies in Mr. Clemens' account. During his deposition, he made statements we know are untrue, and he made them with the same earnestness that many of the committee members observed in person when he visited your offices. In other areas, his statements are contradicted by other credible witnesses or simply implausible. At the beginning of his sworn deposition, Mr. Clemens repeatedly told the committee that he never talked with Brian McNamee about human growth hormone. We know from his later testimony that these statements were false. Mr. Clemens told the committee that Mr. McNamee injected him with a dangerous pain medication, lidocaine, in a public area of a team training room. Dr. Ron Taylor, the team doctor, Melvin Craig, the team trainer, Both told the committee that this account does not make any sense. During his interview on 60 Minutes, Mr. Clemens asserted that Mr. McNamee didn't tell me a word about the Mitchell report, and he lambasted Mr. McNamee for sending him an email about fishing equipment a week before the release of the report. Well, these statements were not accurate. 8 days before the release of the Mitchell report, Mr. McNamee called Mr. Clemens' representatives and told them about the report. Mr. McNamee also allowed Mr. Clemens' investigators to interview him at length about the evidence in the Mitchell report before the release of the report. We know this happened because those investigators secretly taped the interview. There is also a direct conflict between Mr. Clemens' testimony and Mr. Pettit's. During his deposition, Mr. Pettit told the committee that in 1999 or 2000, Mr. Clemens, quote, told me he had taken HGH, end quote. During his deposition, Mr. Pettit was asked whether he had any doubt about that recollection, and he said, quote, I mean, no, he told me that, end quote. Mr. Clemens said this conversation never took place. Mr. Pettit also said he had a second conversation with Mr. Clemens about HGH in 2005. This conversation took place after the committee's hearings on steroids in baseball, when Mr. Pettit asked Mr. Clemens what would he say about the HGH use if asked. According to Mr. Pettit, Mr. Clemens said, I never told you that. I told you that